Yeah.
What month?
Very confusing.
Hi, Virginia. Are you able to hear us now?
Yeah, it's good morning for me. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good afternoon for you. I had a question. I just saw some of the slides I hadn't seen before because I'm usually late, which I don't like, but I'm working on. There was one by Annabella Pitkin. What did she say?
For my mother and all beings, actually. I'm going to run this again because we're on YouTube now.
Because I grew up in Pitkin, Louisiana, and I went to Pitkin school.
Ah.
I just wondered if maybe they're related, whoever founded that town down there.
Oh, I don't know. She's in New York, so I don't know if she has any connection to.
Oh, okay. Good to know. Okay. Thank you.
And Donna's here.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Or it's afternoon there. Good afternoon. Thank you so much.
We've all been saying good morning for some reason. So you're right in tune with the rest of us.
Right in tune. Okay, good. Thanks, Donna. Yeah, everything seems to be fine with the internet so far. We'll keep our fingers crossed. Pray to Tara. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It's a problem all around the country. So.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I didn't realize because, yeah, I called our server here, the provider, and I really didn't have much luck. So I just figured I'd wait it out and see what happens. But good. All right, let's go ahead and begin with the prayers then, Donna, if you would kindly lead us in those. Thank you.
That's not working. There we go. In English, reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of psychic existence and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of all others to the great enlightenment. And let's chant Refuge and Bodhicitta 3 times in Tibetan. Sangye chodang soki chok nam la jang chu bardu dagni kyab suchi dagi chunyen gi pe sonam gi drola pinchir sangye drupar shok. Sangye chodang soki chok nam la jang chu bardu dagni kyab suchi dagi chunyen gi pe sonam gi drola pinchir sangye drupar shok. Sangye chudang soki chok nam la jang chu bardu dagni kyab suchi dagi chunyen gi pe sonam gi drola pinchir sangye drupar shok.
Okay, thank you, Donna. Let's do a short meditation as we did yesterday, and how I like to lead our classes is with having at least a chance to focus the mind a little bit. So we'll do a few minutes of meditation on the breath. And then on the basis of that, I'll lead you in a short reflection. We'll bring to mind some of the points of the other technique for generating bodhicitta that I went through on Friday night. But if you weren't listening on Friday night, that's okay. Don't worry. I'll go over just a few things that we can feed into generating our bodhicitta motivation for today. So again, choose whatever way you want to work with the breath over the next few minutes. I'll ring the chime. Keep in mind that the goal is to try to stay present with the breath as much as you can, but when the mind wanders and you see that that's happened, then just to let go of whatever it was that distracted you. Don't have any judgment, and there's just training our minds to have better concentration. So simply let go of whatever distracted you and bring the mind back to the breath. So I'll ring the chime to start our meditation period. So again, for today's motivation, we're going to use some of the points that we looked at on Friday night in this technique that's called equalizing and exchanging self and others. And the basis for this first step is to equalize oneself and others, to simply have that thought that all the beings that exist, and we can even visualize them in the space around us, doing our best to try to hold this awareness of all sentient beings in this space. Every single one of them is just like you and just like each other, simply wanting to be happy, wanting to not suffer. And for all these sentient beings that are in samsara, they still are bereft of true happiness. They still have to experience suffering. So in this way, we kind of see all beings with an equal mind, kind of see we're all at the same level. We can't point to any one person's happiness and see that it's more important than another's. For all beings desire that same happiness, nor can we point at the freedom from suffering and say that it's more important that one person be free from suffering than others. We are all suffering. And we all want to be free from suffering. So then we go on to do just a brief reflection on how we have actually been guided by a mind that has tended to hold ourselves as more important than others. We just looked at the fact that we're all equal, but we're going to try to adjust our minds to even hold others as more dear than ourselves, because we've been following the pattern of holding ourselves most precious since beginningless time, the Buddha says. But yet we haven't had any real positive results from that. Have we found true peace? Have we found true happiness? Have we gotten free from suffering by being focused on our own needs? So begin to think about your own experience with this first mind, the mind that we call that self-centeredness, self-cherishing. See how it operates in your life, even looking back on earlier today. Sometimes it's very subtle. It's just that way that we get guided into always wanting what we need and not thinking so much about others. We become very attached to things. You can see how a lot of the delusions spring up around this mind of self-cherishing, self-centeredness. So just spend a short while reflecting on that and how it's operative in your life, and begin to develop a wish to move away from it. And then look at the other mind that we're trying to cultivate more deeply. But all of us have this to some degree already, a mind that does cherish others, that puts them first at times. And here too, we can think about this day or recently in our life where we've engaged in actions about benefiting others, where we put our own needs aside because we knew that we needed to be there for them. And that may only be with friends right now, but it is, one way that we cherish others is by not allowing our own preoccupations to get in the way and to be there genuinely for another person. And think about those, and also recall the good feeling that those bring about and generate the wish to adopt the mind of cherishing others even more in your life. So then, as Master Shantideva says, we just reflect briefly on what we've just covered in this meditation. He says, all the suffering there is in the world arises from wanting happiness for oneself alone. All the happiness there is in the world comes from wanting happiness for others. And try to generate again those thoughts of wanting to cherish others, to the greatest extent possible, wanting to diminish our preoccupation with ourselves, because this is an obstacle. This does bring about suffering. And recognizing what His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, that this is actually the way to be wisely selfish, to obtain our deepest state of well-being and happiness. We need to cherish others. And then we cultivate the mind of bodhicitta that is the most far-reaching way to look at cherishing others, to think that we are going to dedicate our life to being a benefit to others, developing ourselves, no matter what it takes, no matter what we have to go through, working on ourselves to be able to become fully enlightened, because we want to enact the welfare of others. Through this, we will achieve our own well-being, the state of Buddhahood, and we will also be able to be fully dedicated to helping others to obtain their state of complete welfare. So hold this mind of bodhicitta that has those two thoughts, the desire to benefit all beings by becoming a Buddha oneself. And just rest in that for a moment, so that becomes your motivation for all that we do today. So in the meditation, I skipped over the steps of Tonglen because Tonglen is quite intricate and could take a little bit more time. But again, that list that we went through on Friday night of all the various steps, it's all set out in the Lam Rim text. You can go back to those and study those, practice those. But this is really the gist of the Bodhisattva path, is that we really put others first. We've called this course this weekend How to Live with Compassion, and we're looking at all these various little bits of advice that Lama Atisha has assembled in only 26 verses, but they all have like these gem-like qualities, things that can actually, when we dedicate ourselves to others, can become the cause for our own attainment of enlightenment and our ability to truly benefit them and help them in the best possible way. So again, we want to do all of this with bodhicitta motivation. Yesterday, we made it up through, I think, the 8th verse. Let me go ahead and pull up the slides and get that all started. The 8th verse, actually, maybe I'll go back a slide or two just to briefly go through the 8th verse, and then we can go on from there. So we're in this section again. I mean, the text doesn't have a lot of structure to it. There is a little bit of an ending to it. There's a little bit of a beginning, but in the middle are just basically lots of bits of advice. And the beginning of verse 8 was talking about how we abandon our frivolous words, all the mindless things that we engage in, because those become a waste of our own time, but they also waste other people's time. And then constantly guarding our speech. We see a lot about speech in this text. We're going to see a bit at the end about that. But the whole idea is that we engage primarily and connect with others through our speech. So we have to be very careful with our speech and try to only use it in the most wise and judicious manner, making sure that we don't disempower our speech. I'm going to pass by those two bits of commentary that we looked at yesterday and go on to the last part of verse 8. When you see your teachers and preceptors reverently generate the wish to serve, those people who play a more central role in our spiritual practice are very important as objects of homage, of offering, of trying to do what we can to please them and bring about their wishes. Someone like Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who's the spiritual director of the FPMT, he has all these projects around the world that he is very dedicated to. We can serve by benefiting those, working on them, providing them monetary offerings that will make those things possible. But essentially, our teachers and those preceptors that initiate us into various sets of vows and practices and so on, they're very, very key in our spiritual development. And of course, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, in the Gelugpa tradition in particular, at the very beginning of our path, we see the need to dedicate ourselves to rely upon our teachers most fully. So again, I'm not going to say a whole lot more about that because this was just to kind of get us back into the text a little bit. But this whole idea of teachers and preceptors does come into verse 9, and that's why I wanted to go back just a bit to share that. It says here in verse 9, the beginning of it, the first 3 lines, toward wise beings with Dharma eyes and toward beginners on the path as well, recognize them as your spiritual teachers. So wise beings with Dharma eyes, that's a pretty interesting phrase there. The whole idea is that those beings who have already opened up their eye of wisdom, if you will, to the Dharma. These are our teachers. We can also see those senior practitioners that have been practicing longer than we have, who have some greater knowledge and awareness of the Dharma. We really do want to hold all of those as spiritual teachers for us, and some to greater degrees than others, those that we decide to call a lama or a guru, which again is a decision you make from your side. They might have those titles because enough people have thought of them in that way. But it's really up to us in terms of who we choose to elevate to that status of someone who we see as a lama and enter into that type of a relationship. But those people who have great Dharma experience are obviously really important as sources of inspiration, as sources of knowledge on our path. But we can also get inspired by what was said in the verse, essentially this idea of beginners on the path. You might wonder, how do you look at beginners as, a spiritual teacher? But there's actually a real refreshing thing that beginners bring to the Dharma. Maybe some of you listening to this are beginners. And when you first enter into Buddha's teachings, you do have a certain level of exuberance and curiosity and sort of wanting to hear everything possible and to figure it all out. And sometimes the questions that people have as beginners are much better than people who study the Dharma for a while because they have that perspective. And so we can learn a lot from beginners, actually. And I had the good fortune in 2015 of being the teacher for the November course over at Kopan Monastery. And this tends to be, though we did have people from, I think, 18, 19 years old all the way up to 70s. Someone, I think it was one guy from the United States that was around 73, 74, something like that. So you do end up with a wide array of people, but it tends to be more heavily focused on the people who are younger. And that's because the younger people sometimes are doing that sort of break between a part of their college or some of their, between high school and college or whatever, or even after college. And they're sort of looking for things. They're trying to find answers to questions. And it was so refreshing to have like a room where the majority of the people there were all these sort of young, exuberant, eager faces, So just know that there's a lot you can learn from those people. The questions that they do ask about the Dharma are really probing at a lot of things that maybe we ourselves haven't even thought about. And so I think it's really good to not turn our minds away from those people who we see as beginners because we think, oh, we just have to hang around with all the real experienced, knowledgeable people. And I do admit that even in some of our Dharma environments, there tends to be, a gravitation of people towards people at their own level, what they might call their Dharma peers. And sometimes there might be obstacles to people who are beginners feeling like they're a part of that. It doesn't happen that often, but, we do have to watch that and make sure that we do feel inclusive of beginners, not just because it's good for them to be included, but we also can learn from them. Hang out with some beginners around, with the Dharma for a while, and you'll see that there's a lot that we can actually take away from that and renew our own sort of beginner's mind and our own sense of excitement about the Dharma. This is something we do have to be attentive to throughout our path. This is not an easy path, and we do need a lot of that kind of enthusiasm and exuberance, and wherever we can get it, And it does help to be inspired by younger Dharma practitioners. And by young, I don't necessarily mean age-wise, though a lot of the people do, who are in that category are younger in age, but young in terms of their perspective, coming in, with their Dharma eyes just starting to be opened, if you will, as opposed to those who already have established Dharma eyes. The last part, the last 2 lines of verse 9 say, in fact, when you see any sentient being, view them as your parent, your child, or your grandchild. This is very similar to what we saw in terms of the technique for developing bodhicitta, right? When we look at that first technique of the 7-point cause and effect, which we examined on Friday night, the very first step is to view all beings as having been your mother, someone dear to you. Well, it doesn't matter whether we think of them as mother or child or, grandparent or whatever the case might be. Anything that helps us to feel dear and close to them is a worthwhile thought towards beings. In that meditation, it's specifically, the mother, because the mother does play a key role in terms of the vulnerability of infants in this world, especially in the human life, in terms of needing to be cared for. And so the mother is generally the person doing a lot of that caring. And so this way we can see how central that is to our welfare when we were quite young and could die, starve, whatever, because we aren't paid attention to. Of course, most parents do pay attention to their children, but nonetheless, it does happen in the world where people are neglected at a very young age. So this is an important kindness that others have shown us. So if we see them through that lens of being somebody very dear to us, then we think about the kindness they're showing us. And I went through yesterday the way that we can kind of look at kindness and appreciate the kindness of others, whether it be direct and intentional, which is what we see with those people who are quite close to us, whether it be indirect and unintentional, whether it even look like they're being unkind, but we can still see it as a kindness. We can choose to do that because if we benefit from others, then we are experiencing some kindness from them, whether they intend to be kind or not. So this is the idea behind this verse, is kind of to see all beings in a light of being very dear to us, very close to us. One teacher, I think it may have been Geshe Awan Dargye, who said, if they're younger than you, you can see them as your child. If they're the same age as you, you can see them as a sibling. And if they're older than you can see them as your parents or as your grandparents or whatever the case might be. Try to have this feeling of closeness. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often says that he feels like when he meets new people, that he's not really meeting a new person, that there's sort of some kinship there already that he can work from, that he can be with that person and be very close to them already. Recall that we really do have to feel that sense of closeness. That was why that process of looking at others as our mother was used in that technique. Because if we don't feel some affection for beings, that they really matter, and we feel some empathy with them, then we're not going to be able to develop genuine compassion. We're not going to be able to live from that space of compassion. So let's go back into the verses. Again, some of these I'm not going to spend quite as much time on. Yesterday we had a few that we spent a fair amount of time on. Some of them are actually really pretty straightforward. But nonetheless, there will be some like this one where we'll get into a little bit more commentary. Renounce negative friendships and rely on a spiritual friend. So this is a whole section in here where it does seem like we're getting a lot of bits about spiritual friends, the people that we hang around with, who we associate with. Here, this is really key advice, is to make sure that we do what we can to protect our minds by not being in what are called here negative friendships. A negative friendship, again, is the idea that people can lead us down a path that is not going to be so helpful for us. When we begin our path, we should actually try to protect our minds even more. But even as we continue on the path, it's important that we not let those influences into our life that could take us astray. And it's, again, we're not trying to make those people into horrible people that we aren't going to be compassionate towards because we feel that their aims and their goals are very different than ours and what have you. I found myself, when I began my Dharma practice, I had a wide array of friends, many of whom had no interest in Buddhism at all. And when they saw me kind of going in that direction, they were probably scratching their head and going, what's Don up to? But I found that I didn't need to kind of make some boundaries to people when people called and they wanted to, drag me in some way to something, some event or whatever that I didn't feel that was as important as maybe going to the center in San Francisco and going to a teaching or what have you. You don't have to get really rude to people. You don't have to turn them away. All you have to do is just keep on your path, keep doing what you're doing. And eventually over time, I have found that the people who weren't as supportive have sort of fallen by the wayside to some degree. The other people who may not even be Buddhist, but they're very appreciative of my Buddhist path and they respect it and they don't have any sort of issues with it, they still are in my life. But the people who were opposed to it or had some, direction they were heading in that was very different than my own, they have kind of fallen by the wayside sort of naturally. I didn't need to like send them letters and say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to see you anymore because I'm a Buddhist now and da da da. So don't think that this renouncing sort of negative friendships means that you have to make an active step in that. Most of the time you won't. There may be some people where you have to start saying no to a little bit more because you know that if they take you down to the nightclub and whatever, of course you can't go to nightclubs right now, but I'm talking about, in the good old days. But if they might take you astray in some way where you're not going to be able to actually maintain good discipline and good behavior and keep your sort of mind to your in a way that will be useful and beneficial, because you're going to get too distracted, might start doing drugs or doing other things, drinking a lot and all this sort of stuff, which may take you off your path quite a bit. So there's a few sayings I want to share in regard to this, and one of them I really like. It was from a bit of advice from this Acho Rinpoche. This is Heart Advice of Acho Rinpoche, translated by Lama Zopa. I found this text, it's a very short text, and it's got some interesting little bits in it. He says, there is no difference between male and female as evil friends of negative karma who make you lose this and all future lives. Therefore, throw them far away like a stone used for cleaning your bottom, kind of like used toilet paper. I assume that at some point, they were using stones to clean their bottoms after they did their business. So anyway, the idea is like use toilet paper. I mean, this sounds kind of, again, very unfeeling, like we don't have compassion for those people. The idea is that we don't want to be under their influence. So do what we can to distance ourselves from them physically to some degree, but certainly mentally. The virtuous friend and virtuous companion is the originator of qualities. Therefore, correctly devote and dedicate yourself to them, to those beings who are spiritual friends for us. So again, this is just, we've got a choice. We can hang out with the people who are going to lead us astray, or we can hang out with the people who are going to actually help us develop our minds. And it doesn't mean, again, that you can't go out with friends for a drink here or there or do whatever, the sorts of behaviors that you were doing maybe before you met the Dharma to a greater degree. It's just be very careful. And especially at the beginning, recognize that because things aren't so stable, there might be some influence from those people. Then the next verse, the second half of verse 10 says, dispel hostilities and unpleasantness and venture forth to where happiness lies. This is an interesting translation. Again, I don't know the Tibetan well enough to know the variation on this, but Alex Berzin, he translated it with the second line of this a little bit differently. Let me rid myself of hostility and uneasy mental states and go happily everywhere. Maybe it's the same meaning to some degree. Venture forth to where happiness lies. That makes it sound like I'm going to go somewhere where we're going to find happiness at the end of the rainbow or something. And that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about the idea that we will actually be able to go happily everywhere if we practice the teachings and if we avoid some of these negative states of mind. States of mind that were mentioned again of hostility and unpleasantness, to kind of always be dour and kind of unhappy and be mean to people around you. I mean, obviously this isn't a bodhisattva behavior. This isn't a way of expressing compassion for others, is to greet them with those sorts of thoughts. You're not going to have people endeared to you, and you're not going to do anything for your own development of positive potential when you're acting that way. So abandon those sorts of minds, dispel all of your hostility, and instead kind of go happily everywhere. I think this is an interesting thing, in our world. Um, it's kind of hard sometimes because, of course, people are always a bit on the defensive, it seems, these days, and always sort of not sure what to make out of anything, out of everyone. I remember when I lived in San Francisco in the 80s mostly. I moved there in 79 and lived there till 98 when I went to the master's program. But as I recall, I mean, my early days there, even into the 90s, I would walk down the street and just try to, smile at people and be happy for people and kind of give them the gift of just someone who's sort of light, moving through the crowd. And people would smile back. I mean, I really found it quite interesting. San Francisco was that type of city at one point where people maybe weren't, I don't know, maybe as concerned and, not opening up to others and what have you. But I've been there a few times since, and I'm not in any way putting the city down. It's still an amazing city, but that seems to be gone. When I would go walking down the street, my last visit, I was walking down to head to the bus station or whatever to go down the peninsula a bit. And I kept smiling at people. And finally, one young woman smiled back at me, and I was like so happy. But this is true. I mean, how are we going to be in the world? Are we going to kind of go happily everywhere? Are we going to bring that happiness with us and become a source of that happiness for others? Or are we just going to kind of go around, fearing other people, being hostile to other people? I got a few quotes that I wanted to share on this as well that come from Geshe Awandarge's commentary. He says, if we are angry and aggressive, happiness will always elude us. Happiness and contentment are dependent entirely on our attitudes towards daily situations and life in general. Full of anger, we cannot even enjoy the good fortune of wealth or delicious food. Yet with peace of mind, we shall be content with the most basic diet and simple dwellings. This is the other thing that having a happy mind can be seen as, is not just in our relationships with others, but even as we are with ourselves in retreat or on our own at home, whatever the case might be. A true practitioner of Dharma should be like a bee that is never attracted to just one flower, but flies from one to another. Unlike most people who are fastidious and critical, a spiritual person should have no preferences. We should be able to adapt to whatever circumstances we find, rather than being so exacting and needing everything to be, precisely how we want them to be. By remaining in one place too long, we make friends as well as enemies and become attached to the familiarity of our environment. Jason Kappa was called the Wanderer because as soon as people heard he was in one place and came to him presenting offerings, he would move on. It'd be like he doesn't want to fall prey to what happens when we don't kind of keep that that sort of flexibility and get stuck in a rut and start, taking things for granted. He acted in this way until he achieved full realization. Then he remained in one place and, speaking from his own experience, gave discourses, founded monasteries, and performed other beneficial activities. So it's no problem to kind of stay in one place when you have the strength of mind to be able to use it well, But and if we don't have that strength of mind, we have to be aware of this, of kind of getting caught up in things and not really looking for just things to be whatever they are and not having any sort of precise demands about what they should be or shouldn't be. I mean, this is a really tough thing for a lot of people. We do get very much into, in the West in particular, are wanting things a particular way and think that if they are always that way, well, then we'll be happy. And once they aren't that way, we won't be happy. My understanding of the early days of the FPMT was that Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopo would keep sending people around all over. They'd become monks or nuns, and they'd go to help start up a center in one place, and then he'd say, okay, you've been there a year or two, now go somewhere else. Kind of keep them like those bees that are sort of moving all over. Well, you become very flexible then. You don't have quite the deep entrenchment that happens when you've stayed in a place for too long, like Lama Tsongkhapa was talking about. So there's this kind of multiple ideas in here. The idea of kind of that we can be a source of happiness wherever we go, but it also means that then internally, we're not going to be so caught up in, well, what really makes me happy? We're going to be just content where we are and not, again, cause others problems through our negative states of mind and, other things. So let's keep going for a few more verses. And by the way, I will do what I did yesterday, which is take a break, kind of 2 breaks within the 3 hours. So they'll each be a short period of time, some 50, 55 minutes into each period. So verse 11 says, abandon attachment to all things and abide free of desire. Attachment fails to bring even the higher realms. In fact, it kills the life of true liberation. So the two goals that are set out there, higher realms and liberation, of course, liberation can also be said to include the liberation of a Buddha, which is beyond the liberation of just someone who's on the individual path. But nonetheless, these are the 2 goals that we are generally trying to achieve, is to gain good rebirths, which is, the higher realms, the states of the higher realms, and then eventually attain liberation and enlightenment. So attachment acts as such a major obstacle to these. Attachment, when I think I mentioned this the other day, when Buddha set out the Four Noble Truths Sutra, his very first discourse, when he was asked what's the source of dukkha, of our state of dissatisfaction we find ourselves in that second noble truth, he didn't go all the way down to the level of detail that we sometimes talk about ignorance being the root of all of that. He said desire, craving, is the root of all of our suffering, all of our difficulty, because it gets us again caught up in the pleasures of this world and clinging to them and spending all of our time with them and being preoccupied with them. We saw this a bit yesterday too, right? All the amount of energy that we put into our mundane things that can really be very it can preoccupy us a lot. What do we call them there yesterday? Material burdens was the word that the phrase that Alex Berzin uses. The material burdens are one thing. Having those things in your life is one thing, but it's the mind of attachment that becomes problematic again. The fact that we don't want to lose those things. We don't want anyone to part us from those things. We should actually learn to let go of things much more. There's that wonderful part of the Shantideva's verses that is in Rinpoche's morning practice that he encourages students in the FPMT to do, that how to transform a suffering life into happiness. Where Master Shantideva says, that we should be gladly giving away things, recognizing that at the end of this life, we're going to have to leave all of it behind anyway. All the good things that we have in life, all the, beautiful objects that we surround ourselves with, all of the books, or whatever it is that you have in your home, every single one of those things you're going to have to leave behind. Well, it's better to do that now when you can and stop the attachment to all these things. We get so caught up in having material things around us in particular, but we can also, of course, have attachment to friends, attachment even to our own bodies, and so on. So we have to work on our attachment. Attachment, as was said in that verse, becomes an obstacle to even getting a good rebirth because we get preoccupied with everything in this life. Remember the 8 worldly concerns we talked about yesterday. Those 8 worldly dharmas are evidence of how much we get caught up in the material stuff, all of our gain, avoiding loss, all of the comforts that we have, the pleasure we experience, always wanting to get that and avoid any discomfort, always wanting to get praise and avoiding any criticism, wanting to have a good reputation and avoiding any ill repute. So again, these are problematic states of mind that we really need to be free of. But attachment is one of the most vicious ones because they often say that attachment is kind of like oil and cloth. So if you get an oil stain on your t-shirt or something, you see how hard it is to get out, right? It becomes part of the fabric. Well, attachment has kind of become part of the fabric of our minds. And in that way, we often can't even recognize it because it just seems to be our default mode, our way of going about living our lives. So there is at least one quote. I don't know if there's more than that I wanted to share on this. This is from oral commentary that Alex Berzin gives that he's talking about his teacher, Geshe Ngawang Dargye, who used to say, life is too short to taste everything. So don't become a professional tourist of samsara. You don't have to taste everything of samsara. That's not going to get you anywhere. And he concludes by saying it's a very helpful piece of advice. A lot of people make these bucket lists. This is a thing in our culture now, right? There was that film Bucket List. But, what is, when it comes down to like a mundane bucket list, I want to see this, I want to go there, I want to, go bungee jumping or whatever the case might be. Well, are those things going to amount to anything? I'm not saying, don't go places and do things. But keep the right mindset to all of it. We become so attached to those things. We need those things. We put all of our money on those things. We think that this is going to be give us some measure of happiness. But attachment, they say, is like drinking salt water to quench your thirst. You never really get satisfied. You just keep wanting more and more and more. So this is the mind that we're trying to overcome that is really quite problematic. So let's go on then to, there's a few more verses. That's right, I added these. There's a wonderful little set of teachings that actually come from one of the Light of the Path retreats where Rinpoche was talking about the happiness of Dharma. And in this context, he was talking about the suffering of not having Dharma. So he says the cause, this is from Geshe Shawagon, the cause of all outer suffering is desire for this life. Therefore, you must renounce the desire of this life. When the desire for achievement in this life is too strong, then your mind is not happy. In mundane terms, we think it's the opposite. We want to just stay really engaged in getting whatever we can out of this life. But in Dharma terms, this is actually the cause of our suffering. When that happens, then all these three happen at once: negative karma, suffering, and a bad reputation. Bad reputation, at least among spiritual practitioners. Again, and maybe in the world, you're actually admired because you have such a dedication to worldly affairs. Therefore, stop the many thoughts, various thoughts of desire. Seeking so many things for the happiness of this life must stop. When you are able to turn away from the desire for this life's happiness, that is the beginning of happiness. So this is, again, the way that we look at it in Dharma terms, is that our happiness actually begins when we begin to let go of our desire for this life. There's actually a story of Drom Tompa, who I mentioned earlier was the heart disciple of Lama Atisha, who composed this text. He was the Tibetan disciple, his primary disciple, who he disseminated all of these teachings to, and he was sort of the lineage carrier from there. And one student was like, I don't know, he was circumambulating a stupa, like you all have a beautiful stupa there at Kadampa Center. He was circumambulating it, and Drom Tompa came up and said, circumambulating stupas is good, but it's better to practice Dharma. And so the student goes, well, then maybe I should be, reciting mantras or something. And so he starts reciting mantras, and Drom Tompa sees him doing this, and he says, reciting mantras is good, but it's better to practice Dharma. And the student's like going, God, what's going on here? And so he decides he's going to, do something else, meditate or do whatever. And he says, meditation is good, but it's better to practice Dharma. And then the student goes, what do you keep telling me? It's better to practice Dharma. What do you mean? And he says, give up your attachment to this life. Give up your attachment to this life. He just keeps telling the student this. This is where Dharma practice begins, is when we stop getting so caught up in the things of this life, the affairs of this life, putting all of our energy and attention into building sandcastles, essentially, that all get washed away at some point. Everything that we do is impermanent in this life. If we actually spend our time dedicated to removing attachment and working on the Dharma, well, then we actually have something we can go forward with, because we will have improved the quality of our minds. And it's only mind that goes forward from this life. So that's, again, just a few additional verses that I thought might be helpful. It's a really wonderful little course they've made it into through Living in the Path, a series that are based on Rinpoche's teachings at Light of the Path. The first part of verse 12, when you were on the third page now of the text, I think, third page. When you encounter the causes of happiness, in these always persevere. So this is the kind of the complement to that, is that, we want to abandon those things that don't bring us any happiness, all the attachment and everything that gets us caught up in more suffering. Here, when we encounter the real causes of true happiness, in these always persevere. This essentially is telling us, that we need to engage in Dharma. So I brought in a few more quotes from a Sangha that Rinpoche used in that little Living in the Path course on the happiness of Dharma. A Sangha says, I assume this is a Sangha based on how I was reading the text, but nonetheless, if it's someone else, I don't know, give them credit at some point. The happiness of enjoying Dharma covers the entire body. It happens whenever you want. It exists in all the three realms. Once you achieve it, you have it wherever you are born. It causes you to achieve the 7 riches of the Aryas. We discussed these yesterday, right? The 7 riches or jewels of the Aryas, those noble ones. By enjoying the happiness of Dharma, it never finishes. It only increases more and more. Enemies cannot destroy it. You can carry it to your next lives. You can complete the happiness of Dharma and achieve satisfaction. So this is the thing about all the stuff that we get attached to in our worldly life. It finishes, right? You have the attachment to it. You listen to it if it's a beautiful piece of music, or you eat it if it's a delicious piece of cake or whatever, and it finishes. You get to the end of it and you kind of go, okay, well, now I need more, and I need something else. Whereas the happiness of Dharma just keeps flourishing and growing within us. It's something that, I found that course when I took it. I actually led it here in Santa Fe for a number of students to look at the happiness of Dharma, and Rinpoche's teaching that. It's very inspiring, because we really need to see where true happiness lies. In fact, there's one little quote that I want to share that I heard Rinpoche teach when he was leading the Guru Yoga, Lama Tsongkhapa Guru Yoga retreat at the Master's Program. Rinpoche very kindly came in September of 2004. The program ended in December of 2004. And he led a month-long retreat on Guru Yoga and that. And one of the teachings, I wrote this down and I went back and I checked the wording of it. And I don't have the exact wording in front of me right now because it just came to mind. But he essentially says that the happiness that leads to suffering, this we have to abandon. You know, that's the happiness of our worldly life, where we just keep going after things and it just leads to more suffering. The second line is the suffering that leads to happiness, this we must adopt. You know, it does take some suffering to practice the path of Dharma, even if it's only the mental anguish of having to kind of turn one's mind in a completely opposite direction. You know, and obviously there's a lot of other things that can be a bit taxing physically. I mean, if we engage in really, you know, dedicated practice, lots of prostrations, Nyungne retreats, all these things, you know, even sitting in meditation for a long time can be a bit physically challenging, but we're mostly talking about kind of all the things that we have to do to move away from our habitual patterns towards the Dharma. But that's the suffering that leads to happiness. That's what we should put our attention into. And that's essentially what Lama Atisha is saying in these two lines. When you encounter the causes of happiness, in these always persevere. Dedicate yourself to those, even if they're difficult. You know, I think this is the hardest thing for us. You know, we want the easy path, right? We want to just, can you give me the easy path, the one where I can get enlightened, like just by sitting at a pool and, you know, drinking Coca-Cola or something? You know, I hate to say it, but there's no easy path. His Holiness even was asked this once at some teachings I went to in 1996 on Nagarjuna's Precious Garland. The question came in, you know, what's the easiest, quickest way to get enlightened? And His Holiness started talking. And then all of a sudden, he started weeping. And it was this huge UCLA auditorium, stadium, whatever. And you could hear a pin drop. You know, everyone just became really quiet hearing His Holiness weep. And when he came up out of this, he told Thupten Jinpa in Tibetan essentially the following. He said he was reminded by getting this question of Milarepa. And Milarepa, you know, as he was approaching his death, he decided he wanted to give a final teaching to his students. So he had told his students to assemble the next morning for a special teaching. And they're all thinking, oh, we're going to get, you know, the real stuff. You know, we've been practicing all this and we're going to get the secret advice and the stuff that will help us to get enlightened even more quickly or whatever. And they arrive, and Milarepa is sitting there, and he just stands up, and he turns around, and he lifts up the back of his robe to show his calloused behind. You know, just from having to sit on rocks and, you know, meditate. He's just, that's it. You know, that's the teaching. You know, I'm not trying to like dissuade people who are new to Buddhism from following this path, but recognize that you get, what's the phrase? You get out of it what you put into it, you know. And if we're really going to get out the results of, you know, from it, the results of complete enlightenment, we have to put a lot in. You know, it does take a lot of perseverance, a lot of effort. You know, so again, don't think that it means, you know, like flipping a switch and you're going from not doing anything to doing everything. No, that's not the right way to do it either. Again, recall that it's a gradual path. We add more and more, we do more and more, we keep testing the waters and we keep moving along, and it becomes natural over time. It becomes self-generating over time because we see that we're actually getting to be better people over the process of that. We're getting to be happier people. We're actually finding the causes of true happiness. So anyway, sorry, I'm giving more commentary than what perhaps I should with the time that we have. Let's go on then to the rest of verse 12, and we'll take a break again in maybe about 5-7 minutes, something like that. The rest of verse 12 says, whichever task you take up first, address this task primarily. In this way, you ensure the success of both tasks, both the one that maybe is tempting you to go off and do, as well as the one that you're currently doing. You know, where otherwise you would accomplish neither. This is kind of like, you know, in our culture, we like this idea of multitasking, right? That we think that we can somehow do many things at one time. There's some scientific evidence that you really don't get much done that way because the mind is much better when it's focused on one thing and taking that to its completion. And then we focus on something else and take that to its completion rather than going back and forth. We may think we like it, but it's just our mind that is clinging to something new. That's a form of attachment too, right? Oh, I want to do that because I'm really kind of bored with this. And then I'll go, oh, I'm getting bored with that. I'll go back to this. And then, and you might even have 10 or 15 things going on at one time. I think people do this a lot of times with books, right? You pick up a book and you read a little part of it and you go, oh, I'm kind of getting bored with that book. I'll come back to it, but let me start reading this one. And then before you know it, you have like a pile of books like this on your, nightstand. Again, it's really helpful to sort of see things through as best as you can, and then go on to something else. And again, it sounds like kind of basic advice. There are some things in this text that almost sound like, again, sort of just practical, common sense sort of things in terms of that. But I do like some of the points that Alex Berzin talks about, as well as I think I may have some from Geshe Awandarge. Well, no, it's verses. This is very similar. If we look at what this verse said, again, whichever task you take up first, accomplish both. You can see how, again, he was influenced by the Bodhisattva Charyavatara, the text by Master Shantideva that predated Asanga by a couple of centuries. It says here, when something has been planned and started on, attention should not drift to other things. With thoughts fixed on the chosen target, that and that alone should be pursued. Behaving in this way, all tasks are well performed, and nothing is achieved by doing otherwise. If thus we act, the secondary defilement, lack of introspection, will not grow. We will end up with our introspection because we kind of are paying attention to what we're doing. We're actually seeing things through. Instead, lack of introspection won't be there. It's a sort of a secondary defilement. It's often called non-introspection in the list, but it's the idea that we aren't sort of paying attention to what we're doing. We aren't again, being mindful of things in that way. So these are, again, just in a reference to the verses that influenced Atisha, perhaps. But I like this again from Alex Berzin. We'll go through this and then we'll take our break, because I found this really, really helpful. And I've shared it with a lot of students, and I think it's really quite amazing. When choosing what to do, though, like what things should I do, how to spend my time, especially in sort of external activities, what people to spend it with, and so on. I put the numbers in here. I'm kind of putting a little structure to what Alex is saying, but he essentially says, first, we choose according to our talents, according to what most needs to be done and what is not being done by many other people. And then thirdly, according to what would benefit the largest number of people. And he goes on to say, this is the advice His Holiness the Dalai Lama gave me. And again, the benefits we're thinking of are not just those that would be realized in this lifetime. So this is a nice guide when we start looking at, well, things are, maybe somebody wants you to get involved in a particular project. You might even look at it and say, well, is it worth my time, first of all, according to my talents? Can I, really contribute to this? Because maybe I lack the skills and ability to do well at it. And so we should maybe direct ourselves to where we can add value because we already have a skill and a talent. Otherwise, we end up trying to acquire a skill in the midst of contributing, and we end up wasting a lot of time potentially. Not that we shouldn't acquire new skills, but once more, we really need to be somewhat measured in how we use our time. That's the whole gist of this exploration. Secondly, according to what most needs to be done and what is not being done by many other people, don't duplicate the efforts of others. Maybe just help them out then. If you want to engage in a particular type of activity, why create a new food bank? Why create a new delivery thing for meals to older people or whatever? I mean, just do what to help others who are already doing that. The third is according to what would benefit the largest number of people. Now, again, as His Holiness says, those benefits aren't just, right now in this lifetime, but maybe we have to think even beyond that. Of course, if we're doing all of our actions with bodhicitta, then maybe we're getting huge benefit. But it is something to be, if we had a choice between helping one person with a particular study of the Dharma or what have you, if that was, one of the things you wanted to focus on, versus helping, a whole virtual Gompa full of people, or a whole center, or whatever the case might be, we can obviously see that there's much greater benefit when there are more people involved. So we do have to be somewhat careful. Again, not to say that we don't give individual attention to others, but recognize that if that's all that we're doing, perhaps we're not doing the most effective thing with our time. Then he shares one more thing. And again, I'll just share this and we can have our little bit of break. Oops. Also, as Rinpoche, who was another Tibetan master who I guess Alex Berzin had some contact with, he says he reaffirmed when he was visiting them in Berlin a little while ago, at least when these teachings were written, when we're choosing how to spend our time and whom to help, another factor to consider is the fourth one, what we personally would get out of it. That's because until we're very high bodhisattvas, there's always going to be some selfish component to our motivations. So for instance, there are certain things we might do that would give us a lot of energy. There are also certain people whom we might help or spend our time with who have a lot of positive energy and who would give us inspiration, whereas others would just drain our energy and make us feel very exhausted after having been with them. So these also can be factors in choosing how to spend our time and whom to help. So I like that last one because seriously, I mean, I do think we have to find something that we feel good about, that we feel very charged about, because that's where we do find our own energy being very easy to stimulate and use and make great progress and what have you. So this whole idea, I mean, I hope you found this useful just to look at this little exploration, because especially people who are involved in Dharma centers frequently are being asked to, do this and do that. Let's get involved in this project and that project. And you might think, well, it's just good for me to do whatever. But I do think we have to have some criteria based upon, those criteria we can then decide how will I dedicate my time. I even look at this to some degree with myself and recognize that, yeah, my time is somewhat limited and I feel charged about teaching myself. I enjoy teaching. So that fourth criterion really makes a lot of difference to me. The fact that I am being continually in a place that feels good for me, that feels very energetic, that feels like it's a good fit, if you will. But recognize that those other criteria are also useful for us in terms of guiding us in particular directions. Where do our talents lie? What aren't people doing that needs to be done? And what will bring the most benefit? So again, I hope that was somewhat helpful, give you a little food to think about perhaps during the break. Let's take a break. It's 11:58 here, 1:58 there. Let's go till 10 after, if that's okay with people. That'll be about a 11-minute break. It just went to 59. So 11-minute break, and hopefully that's enough for people to get a stretch, use the restroom, whatever you might need to do, and we'll resume at 10 after. Okay, see you shortly. Okay. All right. So as I've said in previous classes, if you do have questions that come up while I'm talking, feel free to put those in the chat box, and then I will see them come up there and get to them at some point. And then I'll try to arrange for some time for questions. But as I said, we're kind of dealing with a bit of a tight schedule here in terms of getting through the entire text. But so there was one more little quote from Alex Berzin that I didn't share before the break. And this is kind of a nice one. It says, when it comes to choosing what to work on ourselves, rather than, again, the action sort of out in the world, projects, activities, whatever, the advice is always to meditate on bodhicitta. And this almost sounds like Rinpoche saying this. That is the best thing and the biggest source of energy. And it is really true. Where do we get most of our energy from is by that mind that is intent upon helping others, benefiting others. It's hard for us to move in that direction initially, but it's really important that we do that and that we, find a way to bring that mind to life, if you will. Let's look at verse 13 then. Since you take no pleasure in negative deeds, when a thought of self-importance arises, at that instant, deflate your pride and recall your teacher's instructions. So pride is one of the most difficult of these sort of root delusions and things that kind of can be very difficult as an obstacle in our spiritual development. They often say that pride is kind of like being up on the mountaintops where there's no moisture at all. All the moisture goes down into the valley. So we want to have the humility of being in that lower position to actually benefit from everyone that we meet and learning from them and so on. So pride is a great obstacle to our spiritual development. And of course, we can oftentimes get very prideful, not just about our worldly things, but even our spiritual practice, which is kind of a strange thing. Our spiritual practice is supposed to defeat the delusions, but sometimes we feed our delusions through it. So in this verse and the beginning of the next verse, we're going to look at kind of these two states of mind of kind of the pride that can arise and needing to have antidotes to that, ways to combat that, and then the sort of discouragement that can be there at other times. Sometimes we feel so good about what we've done that we become prideful. Sometimes we feel so lousy about where we're at that we become discouraged. This is part of our spiritual path too, is to recognize that we can't get, into the yo-yo kind of thing where we just go up when things are all going really well and it looks like we're doing an amazing job. And then our teacher tells us something that shows that we really don't know much at all. And we end up, getting really depressed and discouraged. So let's look at what I think I did have one little passage from Geshe Ngawang Dargye, I believe, on this. Pride or conceit is one of the worst emotional afflictions. If we feel that by having developed the awakening mind, bodhicitta, we are superior to others, then everyone will disparage us. If we are supercilious and pompous, no one will find us compatible. As an opponent to arrogance, we should meditate on impermanence and death. Impermanence and death, of course, is an antidote to a lot of things, kind of keep us from having a lot of the delusions because we recognize how fleeting and temporary everything is, and we don't get so invested in it, perhaps. But, the fact that here it's being used to address our prideful state, our haughtiness, pompousness, this is a really worthwhile one as we sort of recognize again that all of this that we are taking pride in, everything changes. Everything sort of, moves along. We end up leaving this life. Death will happen to us too. We're all sort of equal in that regard. There's no point in being sort of full of ourselves. One of the other antidotes to pride, though, that's often set out in the traditional teachings is to reflect on those things that we don't have much knowledge of. We can say, well, yeah, I know this and I know that, and I feel really good about that, but how much is there that we don't know? And the fact that we aren't even liberated, much less enlightened yet, we shouldn't feel that full of ourselves when the reality is we still have quite a distance to go. But once more, don't let that lead you to the other mind, what we're going to talk about next, which is discouragement. Just recognize that there's no point in getting too caught up in just what are sort of minor achievements along the way. Feel good about those, develop some self-confidence from those, but don't become prideful. And pride is that delusion where we puff up our mind and we just think that we're better than others and so on. Not a useful mind for us to learn from every situation, which is how we're ideally supposed to be looking at our lives, that everything is a learning opportunity. The next, again, 2 lines have to do with the other side of it. Again, the discouragement that we often have. When discouraged thoughts arise, uplift your mind. And there's another way that this is taught in terms of see the sublime nature of the mind, the sublimity of the mind, I think is the way it was translated in the book Advice from a Spiritual Friend that I've been referring to, that Geshe Awan Dargye commented on. But the idea here is that one of the most powerful things to uplift our minds is to think about the nature of our minds in terms of Buddha nature, that our minds have the potential to develop to the greatest degree. I'm going to share a few thoughts that Geshe Awan Dargye has from that Advice from a Spiritual Friend. He says, very few people have a steady or stable experience of life. For most, their emotions ebb and flow like the tides, or go up and down like a yo-yo. Sometimes we may feel proud of signs, it's supposed to be signs, not sings, signs of accomplishment. And yet at others, we may be depressed when our defilements and habitual propensities overwhelm us. This is what I was mentioning earlier, right? We have those 2 ways that we get really inflated and full of ourselves, and then we go way down when we suddenly see, all the work we have yet to do, or whatever the case might be. All such feelings, he says, are relative to one another, because discouragement exists only in relation to elation. Neither one is independent. It is beneficial if our life flows with little major change like a wide river. Therefore, we should not become too excited when we accomplish a great deal, or depressed when we fail to do so. If we feel self-pity, we should contemplate on our good fortune at having a fully endowed precious human form, and I would go on to say, and at having Buddha nature. Anything that helps us to focus on the positive things that we have is really useful. But with kind of a mind that is more balanced, then it is like what it says there. Our life flows on with, little major change. Our minds stay the same in the face of whatever it is that's going on. We do our work and do some meditation, and we feel really good about where we're at with our understanding of emptiness, which is coming up soon, or whatever topic. And then we hear some teachings and we go, oh my gosh, I really don't know much about this at all, and I'm really confused now. And then we feel really bad about ourselves and get so discouraged and think, oh, Buddhism isn't for me, or whatever. If we have just this sort of view that sort of takes it all in and recognizes that this is the nature of things. Sometimes things are going to be really going our way and look like we're really getting it, and other times they're not going to be doing so well and feel really discouraged. That's okay. Don't get caught up in the emotions that go with that. All right. So I think that was all that I had in terms of additional material to share on that. Go to the last part of it. Here it is. And meditate on the emptiness of both of these emotions, self-importance and discouragement. Now, what's kind of interesting is that it's not translated quite that way in other commentaries. This is Thupten Jinpa's translation of the text, and I don't have a commentary from Thupten Jinpa as to why he includes self-importance and discouragement in the parentheses, the brackets behind the both there. All that's in the text is both. Meditate on the emptiness of both. In the very next lines we're going to see, when we get to those, we're talking about objects of attraction or aversion. And I think it's actually that, I think it was Geshe Awan Dargye said that was how he was interpreting it, is that you see the emptiness of both the objects of attraction and the objects of aversion. I think Alex Berzin interprets it as the emptiness of both samsara and nirvana. It really doesn't matter because we're supposed to meditate on the emptiness of everything. So what do we mean by emptiness? I'm going to go into just a little bit on emptiness because I think it is a key part, once more, of our bodhisattva practices. And of course, if we're using it right, it can actually help us not just to deflate all of our own delusions and craziness, but it maybe even connect better with others because we understand more clearly how things exist. And we also understand that beings are not in line with that, and that's why they suffer. That's why we suffer. So once more, this mind of emptiness, it's a negation. It's saying that things are lacking something. They are empty of something. So we have to say what they are empty of. Venerable Rabbeinu oftentimes uses like a blue coffee mug, and she says, this blue coffee mug is empty of red. It has no red on it. It's all blue. So we're talking about kind of some quality that things lack, that things don't have. So what is that quality? Sometimes it's referred to as inherent existence, and people kind of scratch their head and go, well, really, what do you mean by inherent? We're talking about things having a reality that is capable of setting themselves up, establishing themselves. It's kind of like existing independently. This is why, again, one thing I'm going to want to go through today is talking about emptiness is a very brief introduction to the idea of dependent arising. What the Buddha says is that we think things have an independent existence, that they exist on their own. They set themselves up. They don't need other factors for their existence. Even though we can understand through our experience that there are factors involved in things coming into existence, we still think they have some independent identity, that their identity is established from the side of that object that we're talking about. Whereas things are actually dependent arisings. They come into existence on the basis of a variety of factors, and they never exist independent of those. So let's look at these three levels of dependent arising that I'm hoping we can just do this a little bit as an introduction to this topic. excuse me, sorry. The reasoning of dependent arising essentially looks at three levels that we can talk about. The first one pertains, as it says in the footnote there, to only compounded phenomena. What do we mean by compounded phenomena? Those things which are created are composed on the basis of their causes and conditions. So that includes a lot of what we deal with in our world, right? All the physical things in the world have causes and conditions. Even our own mind has causes and conditions. But there are a few phenomena that exist that are not compounded phenomena, that are actually permanent, unchanging phenomena. But let's just talk about, things in a very basic way and not get too much into terminology. So the very first one are those things that depend upon causes and conditions. So when we talk about, for example, that coffee mug that Venerable Rabina, will sometimes use and heard talking about it, that depended upon causes and conditions to come into existence. We had the main substantial cause of the sort of ceramic material, clay, whatever that was made into. Let me make sure that the volume is okay. I'm getting a signal from Donna that might be problematic. Let me just make sure. Is that better? A little bit better? Okay. Sometimes I think, yeah, this has to be placed a little bit closer. So the first level of dependent arising is the idea that things do have their causes and conditions that are entailed in them coming into existence. So for a coffee mug, again, it can be the raw stuff that it's made from, but also all the other factors that contributed to it, the person who designed it, the person who, painted it, all the paint that's involved in it, what is it, like the enamel glossing or whatever that goes over it, the firing of it, all these things. And then, of course, there are many causes involved in all of those things. There are an endless number of causes and conditions involved in any single object that is produced, that is composed. So does the coffee cup or any particular object like that exist independent of its causes and conditions? Of course not. It depends upon them. And without those causes and conditions, it doesn't come into existence. So we all get this. We all go, okay, well, what's the point? I get it. The second level starts getting a little bit subtler. It's the fact that things exist independent upon their parts. And so for the coffee mug, we would say something like, the base of the mug, the handle of the mug, the outer part of the mug, the inside of the mug, the bottom of the mug, whatever. And we get into all the various things that are part of the coffee mug. Can you have a coffee mug without those parts? Well, again, you might be okay using it for a while without a handle, but hands are going to start to burn, perhaps. So we see that really for a full functioning cup, we need all the parts. There is this idea of the whole cup that depends upon all the parts. We have a whole body that depends upon all the parts of the body. And again, you can still say you have a body with missing a few parts, but nonetheless, to have body established, you have to have some parts there. You have to have the parts of a body for body to be existing. Does body or cup or any produced phenomenon, or any phenomenon for that matter, exist independent of its parts? Here's its parts and here's the phenomenon. No, that doesn't happen. The parts and the whole have an interdependence. Now at the third level, where it gets even subtler, is the fact that when we start looking at these parts as being a basis for what we call cup or what we call body, and we get into the whole idea that the only way that body or cup or any phenomenon exists is because we designate it, we impute it as that. It has nominal existence. It's just designated, thought of, And we are talking to some degree about language, but not solely language. We're talking about a concept that we form around organizing our world. We organize our world so that we can refer to some things as cups and some things as people and some things as, trees and whatever the case might be. And this is how we get along in the world, is by organizing our world this way. But we think that there's something more from the side of the object so that it's not just labeled. We label it, we give it a name, we think of it in a conceptual way, but then we think it's got that identity from its own side. So really this third level gets at the way that we really understand the mistake that we're making. We think that things have some objective existence when actually it's purely subjective. It's purely nominal. Our naming and designating things is all that things have. Now, again, cups and things like that are not, the biggest problem we have. Certainly our bodies become great objects of attachment. Sometimes cups and other things do as well. But the biggest problem that we have is we think the I, the person, exists in this way, that we have some sort of independent status. And so the techniques are taught to go investigating to see if you can find that in that independently existing person. And you can't. That's because the person exists in dependence upon being designated. If we look at this collection of stuff, what's on the screen before you right now, which is my body, and of course my mind is here. You can't see my mind. It's not physical, but you can assume my mind is here because I'm rabbiting on and talking and what have you. So when you look at all of this in front of you, that's actually just the basis for a person. That's the basis for Don. There's no real Don in front of you at all. Don is a label we put on this collection of stuff. My parents gave me that label. They named me after my father's uncle who died when he was young. So anyway, Donald is my actual full name, is a label we give to this collection of stuff. There's no Donald that exists on this stuff, a part of this stuff. We can't find a real Donald here. It's just simply a designation. And we're all doing this. We're thinking of our own particular collection of stuff that's a basis for the person as a real person, as if there's a real person there. And there's no real person there in the way that we think it is. The person does exist because the person is a designation, an imputation, but nothing more than that. As Lama Zopa says, it's almost as if you don't exist, but you exist. The Buddha never said emptiness means you're empty of existing or empty of functioning or empty of anything else. It's empty of being independently existing, existing apart from all these factors. So I know this may end up kind of opening a huge can of worms by talking about emptiness, but it's here in the text because it is a central part of our bodhisattva path. Recall that we have the two wings of a bird. We have the wisdom wing and the sort of compassion, the method wing. We are mostly talking on this side this weekend, compassion and method and what have you. But you need conventional wisdom, but you also need ultimate wisdom. You need to know how things actually exist in the end. Because without that wisdom, you can't become a Buddha. You need both wings in order to fly to the land of enlightenment, and the analogy of these being like the wings of a bird. So let's go back to the verse or to the slide and look at, again, this review then upon things depend upon causes and conditions when they are produced through causes and conditions. There are a few phenomena, and I'll give you a hint. Emptiness is one of them that doesn't have causes and conditions. It's a negation. It's a lack of independent existence. It exists, but it doesn't depend upon causes and conditions. Whereas the cup, the body, the person, all of these do depend upon causes and conditions. They all depend upon parts, and in the end, they depend upon mere imputation or designation. Kind of having an idea that this is what that is, and we had some conventional agreement with regard to that, we then designate things. And that's the only way that phenomena exist in a conventional sense, because they lack anything more than that. They don't have an ability to stand on their own from the side of the basis. So what that leads us to then is the latter part of verse 14, which is this idea that when objects of attraction or aversion appear, this is why it does make some sense to interpret the both that we saw here, meditate on the emptiness of both the objects of attraction and the objects of aversion rather than self-importance and discouragement or anything. But as I said, all phenomena are empty, so it doesn't really matter what you correlate those to. But know that here we're being given the advice that when we do have things that attract us, that cause us to have attachment, or things that cause us to have aversion that are unpleasant in our lives, view them as you would illusions and apparitions. Well, an illusion or an apparition is something that has a particular appearance, but the appearance isn't in line with reality. This is pointing to the fact that even with our understanding of emptiness, things do appear to have some substantial independent existence. They seem to exist out there on their own. They don't seem to exist dependent upon all these various factors I just went through. They seem to be independently existing. This is due, they say, to the fact that we have had this ignorance in our mind since beginningless time. It's created imprints in our mind that are the subtlest obscurations we have. These are actually what they call the obscurations to becoming a Buddha. The grosser obscurations are all the delusions, the ignorance, the attachment, all the things we've been talking about that are the enemy, the things we want to get rid of. Those we get rid of first, but where the subtler ones are playing a role is that they are causing things to appear to exist in that way. So we have kind of these different things going on. So let's say again, you have the cup that if you can recall the first time, I don't certainly, but if you can recall the first time you learned what any particular object was, somebody presented it to you and then they said, oh, this is and they gave a label to it. Let's even use a modern example. I remember when the iPad was introduced, right? And it was kind of funny. There were all these people in line in Albuquerque outside the Apple store, and they were interviewing one. And one said, they asked me, "You're here to get the Apple iPad?" And they said, "Yes." And he said, "Do you know what it is and what it does?" And the person says, "No, but I want one." So we get kind of enticed in images of things. But say you're introduced to kind of an iPad, as we all were. We didn't know what an iPad was before an iPad existed, before somebody, Steve Jobs and all the people came up with all of this technology that presented this thing, this tablet that they call the iPad. Okay, so the iPad, as soon as we learn the name of it, it's like the name of it sort of absorbed into iPad, and then it appeared to be an iPad from its own side. It's got its own iPad-ness to it that covers the whole object. This is the way that these subtle imprints work, is that we aren't satisfied just at naming something and merely designating it, merely imputing it. It seems like it's got its own reality. It seems like it's established out there on its own. That's because it appears that way to us. So we have a really hard time breaking free of the clinging to that because everything looks like that. I often use the analogy of a dream object because in your dreams, if you dream like I do, things can appear very real. You can get really caught up in it, right? And you can have a lot of emotions in your dreams. But when you wake up, you come to understand that all those dream objects that were scaring you or enticing you or whatever the case might be, they weren't real in the way you thought they were, but they appeared real. Without a doubt, they appear real, or we don't have those emotions coming into play. Well, it's the same thing in terms of our everyday life. When everything else that we're seeing outside of the dream, though even in the dream, we would say they all have that false appearance. They all seem to exist on their own. That level of existence doesn't exist at all. First, we have to get rid of our assenting to that, our agreeing to that, our believing in that. That's what I was talking about in terms of the reasoning of dependent arising and the reasoning of looking for this inherently existent person in the body and mind and what have you. A lot of different reasonings that help us to undermine that ignorance. But we still have the appearance. Things still falsely appear as if they have that concrete independent existence. So here the idea is that, going back to the verse, whenever you have objects appear, whether they be objects of your aversion, your jealousy, or your pride, whatever the case might be, your attachment, see them as like illusions. They appear to exist in one way, but we know they don't really exist that way. I mean, another way that you could say, like dreams. There's nothing wrong with using dreams. The Buddha used it as an analogy all over the place. Everything is like a dream. It doesn't mean it is a dream. It is like a dream. Just the same way that dream objects appear to be real, in the waking life, our objects around us and ourselves all appear to be real in a way that is not established when we actually wake up, when we actually wake up to the reality of things in terms of their emptiness. So there are a few verses I wanted to share on this from the 37 Practices of a Bodhisattva. We saw a few of those verses yesterday, the one around the homeland and so on. So here we have first verse 23, when you encounter attractive objects, though they seem beautiful, like a rainbow in summer, don't regard them as real and give up attachment. This is the practice of bodhisattvas. So this is kind of the first one that we saw in terms of objects of attraction, those beautiful objects. They seem to be beautiful from their own side. They seem to have all this identity from their own side. They don't have it. They lack all of that. We're not saying beauty doesn't exist or that the object doesn't exist. They just don't exist in the way that they appear. They're not real in the way that they appear. Then the other side of it, all forms of suffering are like a child's death in a dream. Holding illusory appearances to be true makes you weary. Therefore, when you meet with disagreeable circumstances, when you have objects of aversion, see them as illusory. This is the practice of bodhisattvas. So whether we say see them as not real, see them as illusory, see them as like a dream, it's pointing to the fact that we have to have this sort of mindfulness, this awareness that the way things appear and the way they exist are not in line. For all that phenomena that we are looking at ignorantly, how they appear and how they actually exist in terms of their emptiness are not congruent. They're actually in opposition. So we have to keep our awareness of emptiness even while we're going about our day. They often say, you realize the emptiness on the cushion, and then when you get up, when you deal with things in your life, eating food, going here and there, seeing people, you try to have that view of them being like an illusion. Everything appears so real, but they all lack inherent existence. None of them independently existing. This is true for all phenomena. Even emptiness itself is empty of inherent existence. It doesn't have its own ability to stand on its own. It's merely imputed, merely designated. So this isn't a weekend on emptiness, or I would be going into greater detail on all of this. But since it's in the text and it's an important part of the bodhisattva practice, I thought I would at least address it there. Let me see a few comments. First, I want to go back up earlier about a question that Susie, you had commented something that you had a question up earlier, but I don't see it earlier in the
I
chat
can
box.
just ask you.
Sure, that would be great.
You may have answered this for me, but it was
Okay.
about when thinking about how bodhisattvas might behave, how you would regard people that are extremely difficult to be around or to think about.
Mhm.
And I remember Geshe-la and I think Venerable Rabina have said, put distance between you and them.
Yeah.
How does this relate to that idea?
The emptiness teachings, or how does it
The
just...
garland. because
Oh,
I
okay.
had
Okay.
this
Yeah.
before today's started.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that I always call this the first line of defense. If we have difficult people in our lives that we don't have the strength of mind to be with, then being physically distant from them, it may be the best option. Or if they're kind of in the category that we looked at earlier today, where they're sort of misleading friends, people that are going to take us down a wrong path, well, then it is good to maybe put some physical distance there. But we can develop the strength of mind to be with those people and actually bring them into our spiritual path. This is the whole thing of mind training, that we went
Happens
into
a
the
little
other
at
night.
a time.
Yeah.
Here and there.
I mean, it's exactly, I always look, compare it to when people bottom out and decide they want to, address their substance abuse or their alcoholism, whatever, and they make a decision to move in an opposite direction. They don't hang out with all their bar buddies and their user friends,
Right.
because it's not useful. They're not going to be supported in that necessarily. I'm not saying, across the board, but absolutely that's not the best place for them to be, because the temptation is going to be too great. It's going to be too hard because they don't have strength of mind. For some who have dealt with substance abuse, you may get to a place in your life where you can actually be back in the presence of those things. You can go to a Thanksgiving Day gathering and have people drinking wine around you, and you don't even get bothered by it in the least. There's no temptation. Well, that's the same thing. You're just talking about developing the strength of mind to now be able to be around that and maybe have a totally different mindset. And in the bodhisattva path, it's the mindset of I'm actually going to try to benefit, developing greater patience, greater fortitude, greater ability to be compassionate and loving and kind in the face of those people who are really difficult.
Today, in terms of political issues, that comes up for me. But it really helped me when you had the example. I believe it was yesterday. It might have been Shariputra who didn't have the mental ability with his hand cut off, and he sort of blew up.
Yeah. It's like,
then went back down to Hinayana or whatever.
Yeah. And that's one reason why it's good to maybe avoid the difficult people in the beginning as well, is because they may be too
Mm,
discouraging for us, as well on this Mahayana path, because the Bodhisattva wants to keep their heart open to everybody. But if you're just running into these really awful people that are so hard to work with, my gosh,
yeah, they may not be awful,
Yeah,
but to me, they're
yeah,
right.
yeah, I
Yeah, yeah.
understand.
And
Good.
emptiness plays in that, and I appreciate all
Oh,
of that.
sure,
Yeah.
sure. And yeah, emptiness, of course, is the final antidote to all of these delusions and all the problems that
Mhm.
we have in our minds. Because if we actually see that it's just sort of a play of causes and conditions and imputation and whatever, we don't get so invested in it. Just like if you have a lucid mind when you're dreaming and are aware that these are
Mhm.
dream
Yeah,
objects, then you don't get caught up in it, right? You don't go, oh, this dream elephant is, charging towards me. I need to get really upset and angry and run or whatever. You just say, oh, it's just a dream elephant. I don't have to be so concerned about it. Anyway, it's a
thank you.
similar thing. Thank you, Susie, for that. And then there's a comment from Naga. I take humble pride in being able to submit a research proposal for a class just now. This class helped me to be kind to self and the work, then rather than being sad and depressed this week from losing a family member. Now, I'm so sorry to hear about your loss, Naga. Yeah, no, and I think, if we do sort of, again, there's nothing wrong with the sort of, I don't like necessarily using pride there, because we try to reserve pride for delusion, though in the tantric path, we talk about divine pride, but you can develop some good feeling on the basis of accomplishing things and having, work done well, and that's great. Infuses our self-confidence, makes us feel good about our contribution to the world and so on. Absolutely. So I think, these are good things for us to rely upon at times, is to really be rejoice in our good patterns and habits, even when they're in, doing papers or proposals or whatever the case might be. And then Donna says, I always find it interesting that the first test given to Adam in the Bible is to name everything. Yeah, it is. Shows how powerful designation and imputation are. Things become real to us when we have a name for them. I mean, and again, the naming is an essential part of knowing the world. As I've used this phrase, and I've never run it past any of my teachers to see whether it's really correct. Though the teaching assistant in Italy thought it sounded fine. John Gendon is his name. Is that essentially we organize our world, and we need to organize our world. Otherwise, we couldn't be in the world and relate to others and know what's going on. But then we think the world was sort of already organized that way. It has the organization from its own side. It's just kind of our filling in the blanks in a sense. But the world is not organized, really. We are organizing the world through our thoughts, through our imputations, naming everything as Adam, did in the Bible. Thanks for sharing that, Donna. Okay, so I think that's all the questions I saw, and I would really like to do a little bit more in the text before we take another break. And as I said, I will have an opportunity for more questions, hopefully towards the end. So, verse 15, let's move on. When you hear unpleasant words, view them as mere echoes. When injuries afflict your body, see them as the fruits of past deeds. Echo is another thing that's sometimes used as an analogy for emptiness, but here it's not quite the same thing. The idea is that when you are in an amphitheater or a canyon or something, and you yell words out like, hello, like they often do. There's a wonderful amphitheater north of here near Abiquiu, just past Abiquiu, that's kind of interesting to go do that in. So the idea is that when unpleasant words come back to you, it's like the echoes that you sent out in terms of the words that you yelled into the canyon coming back into your own sphere of experience. So you created the unpleasant words through the force of your own derogatory words that you used, harsh words that you used, and so on. The second one is the physical side of it. The first one was speech. The second two lines are when we experience injuries on our body, when others injure us or we get injured here and there. They're the fruits of our past physical deeds. Why do we have physical harm to the body? Because we've created physical harm to the bodies of others. Why do we hear unpleasant words? Because we've thrown those unpleasant words out to others. So essentially, this is a teaching on karma. And just to remind ourselves, again, as I mentioned yesterday, karma and a lot of the other teachings are sort of put into this text of the Bodhisattva's path because they're a reminder that we have to practice those at the lower level, certainly, and get the understanding there. But also we can apply them at the greater level, the level of bodhicitta. Well, if you look at it in a bodhicitta way of explaining this, you would say that I don't want to get upset at the unpleasant words I'm hearing from others because I see that I've directed those words at them. So out of compassion for them, why should I do the same thing? Why should I get bound up in this circle of just creating more and more harmful words between myself and that other person? Or if I'm experiencing injury from another person, why should I injure them when my injuring them got me into that predicament in the first place? I wouldn't be injured by them had I not created the causes. Therefore, for me to continue to injure them once more gets me caught up in a cycle where I'm not having any compassion for that person. One of the best things we can do for other people in our lives is to break free of these patterns, to not keep going back and recreating the same karma again. It often happens, I hate to say it, but it happens in, very close relationships, intimate relationships. The people who we love the most are sometimes the people we're caught up in some of the most heinous cycles with, because we find these ways of sort of kind of keeping that alive, keep, bothering them, badgering them with various things, and they keep badgering us with certain stuff, unless you have a really ideal relationship. And if you do, then I prostrate to you. Most of us have relationships that are mixed. We love the person well enough and we bear with some of it, but we do have patterns that creep in that are very damaging. They're sort of rotting from below kind of thing. They don't make it really wholesome and beneficial. If you really care and are compassionate towards those people in your lives that you are quite connected to, stop disengaging in those patterns. Seeing that they're the creation of your own karma, we then can understand that if we want to keep creating the same karma again and harm that person more and have them keep harming us, well, then go right ahead. But if we want to break free of all of it, and if we really genuinely care about the other person, then cut those things. Stop creating that type of karma. Recognize that it's a karmic creation, and therefore, why would we want to keep creating it again? It's only going to harm ourselves and others. So let's go on to verse 16. Verse 16 I mentioned yesterday because it goes back to that idea. Oh, sorry, I've got one more thing that I threw in my little slides here on verse 15. This is just a verse from the Wheel of Sharp Weapons. Many of you have studied this text. This also is said to be a sort of mind training text. And Dharma Rakshita actually was one of Atisha's teachers. So this kind of maybe predated to some degree Lama Atisha. Whenever suffering arises in our mind, it is definitely the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having disturbed the mental continue of others through saying unpleasant words to them, through harming them, injuring them. Now we should willingly take upon ourselves all their dukkha, all their dissatisfaction and suffering without exception. That text in particular uses the techniques of taking and giving a lot. Tonglen that I talked about on Friday. We should be willing to take on the suffering of others when we see that others are harming us. Take it on, don't retaliate, as I was saying, and be content in the space of that. Verse 16, as I said, I mentioned yesterday, because of the solitude idea, dwell utterly in solitude beyond town limits. Like the carcass of a wild animal, hide yourself away in the forest and live free of attachment. Kind of an interesting idea, like the carcass of a wild animal. But it's not to say, again, that this is advice for everybody across the board. When we find that there is a time in our practice where it makes sense to abide in solitude physically, then we do this. But once more, as I mentioned yesterday, we can have some level of solitude even while we are among people, not letting ourselves once more get caught up in all the delusions that are entanglements with others, but rather stay grounded in the space of our own practice. But here it is mainly talking about the actual process of going out to the silent areas where we can engage in more dedicated meditation. So this is very similar once more to Shantideva's verses that some of you may be familiar with from his 8th chapter on meditation. There, with no befriending or begrudging, I will stay alone in solitude, considered from the outset as already dead, like that carcass of an animal, thus when I die, a source of pain to none. Then there will be no one standing by in tears and mourning thus to trouble me, and no one will be there distracting me from thinking of the Buddha and the practice. Therefore, in these lovely gleaming woods, with joy that's marred by few concerns, where mental wandering will cease, I will remain in blissful solitude. So this is the idea behind, the similar thing that, was in the verses. And I like Shantideva's version of that as well. Milarepa is quoted by Geshe Awandargye, who said, "If my relatives do not hear of my happiness, my enemies do not learn of my suffering, and I die alone without any mourners, then all my wishes as a yogi will have been fulfilled." It's kind of interesting because normally, in our culture, that's like the most horrible thought, right? I mean, certainly what's going on with COVID-19, where many people are having to be isolated from their family members in the last stages of their life, is pretty horrific. I mean, because of the whole situation of what's all going there. But for those meditators who have really, worked on their minds, they don't want all of the distraction of people coming in and mourning over them and grieving about them before they've even left. They want to be very solid in their own practice at that time. And again, you can read some of Lama Zopa's advice in the book, How to Enjoy Death. He goes into how to, make sure that we have a proper space in which people can die so that they don't have all of those things distracting them and pulling them back into this life. As was mentioned earlier, we have so many attachments to things in our life that it'd be very hard to separate from all of these at the time of death if we haven't worked on it previously. So if all those things sort of reappear at the end of your life, for a practitioner, that may be the worst possible thing. That's why it's also good for practitioners who are concerned about that time of their life to set out your advanced directives as much as possible. Talk to friends and relatives. Say, it's nothing against you. I just need you to not come when I'm in my final stages. It might be too difficult for me, disruptive to me in terms of my own spiritual path. And anyway, this is what was said there. I shared what His Holiness shared yesterday. I'm not going to share it again, but recall this is where I normally share, where I told you that I would be sharing something about His Holiness's question from the woman who said, my husband's going to go away and live in the mountains and meditate for years. And is this how Buddhist practitioners, work this? Or do they leave their whole family behind and leave everybody to fend for themselves and go off to the woods? And His Holiness saying, no, there's very few people who have that ability to do that. In fact, it's very rare. And so most of us will probably need to continue to live an engaged life, a life where we are involved in kind of the world around us and doing what we need to do and doing the best that we can, kind of engaging those activities I talked about earlier, the criteria that we can look at in terms of how we spend our time. Do those things and gain great merit from them, doing them with bodhicitta and living your life. And maybe a time in your life will come where it's good to be off in solitude, but maintain your commitments, especially to your family. My gosh, those people are such a core part of your well-being that to leave them at a time and say, it's more important that I engage in spiritual practice is probably not the wisest thing to do. Now, we do have the model of the Buddha doing that as Prince Siddhartha, right? He became very distressed at the suffering he saw and decided to leave his wife and young child, behind at the palace and go off seeking enlightenment. There may be some people, again, that is their path. That is the directions we should be taking, but it's best to rely upon others to help us make that decision, gurus and so on, and to go through a more involved process before just deciding to shut off one's life and go off into the woods. And as Lama Zopa Rinpoche said in the last Light of the Path retreat in 2017, I really took note of this. He said, a lot of people have this idea that they're going to go off into the woods and get calm abiding like that, but he says if they haven't developed the merit for that, if they haven't actually put in all the practice that precedes that, it could be a total waste of time. So this is why it's good to get the advice of a guru, to actually look at things a bit more clearly, to decide, because we can romanticize that idea, of going off into some cave somewhere. As one of my friends who goes to Nepal often though says, all the good caves are already taken, So be prepared for that too, Let's go on to another couple verses before we take our last little break here. Verse 17, the first line of this, I'm just going to comment on that because there's a couple of different interpretations of this. Always remain firm in your commitment. Well, I think the word in the Sanskrit would have been samaya, commitment, because here the Alex Berzin translates the idea of there, when I am in solitude and in retreat, let me always be stable with my Buddha figure. This is one of those tantric references. Remember how I mentioned there would be a few tantric references here and there in this text. The Buddha figure is the same as what we might call our Yidam, our main deity, our principal deity that we are practicing, meaning the Buddha that we have been initiated into. So in Tantra, what happens is you obtain an initiation from a qualified lama that gives you permission to do deity yoga. I talked about deity yoga when I did my little class on Tara earlier this week. It's where through the force of that empowerment and receiving those sorts of blessings, you sort of awaken these potentials to activate them and make them into your own path to enlightenment. So you get we had green Tara on Wednesday night and Tuesday night when we talked about that. Green Tara is a particular figure that we can be empowered into, and then we begin to see ourselves as green Tara, to act from that place of being this enlightened being already, and follow all of the commitments, the samaya that is involved in the tantric practice. So this is what this is referring to without going into more detail on what's all involved in Tantra. Let me read Geshe Awandarge's commentary on this, which was in line with what Alex was interpreting it as. To stabilize our personal deity or yidam means that we should always confirm the motivation for our actions and bear in mind the goal of complete union with the fully awakened state that our yidam symbolizes. So we talked about this the other night, that the full figure of green tar, it represents the full enlightenment, the complete enlightenment in terms of all the various aspects, the qualities that are developed on the path brought to their full culmination. And we can see that as what we are trying to do in our tantric practice, to bring ourselves to completion, to develop our qualities completely so we can be green Tara, we can be Haruka, we can be Vajrayogini, whatever the case might be. So again, if we look at any other ways of interpreting that, just the verse was essentially saying, what verse are we at? 17. Always remain firm in your commitment. Of course, we make lots of commitments in terms of our path, lots of things that we are dedicated to, that we make even promises to our guru. We go to Rinpoche or something and we ask for our lifetime practices, and Rinpoche kindly gives us all this advice about what we should do. We should take all of our commitments very seriously, remain firm in those. I think it is important. I know there will be times in people's lives where it's hard to do all the mantra recitations or the practices that you've agreed to, that you've made commitments to. If you can do them in spite of that, even just reciting them without all the visualizations and other things involved, keep doing them. I think there's something positive about that energy of the continuity of maintaining your commitments. But nonetheless, there will still be times. I mean, I keep thinking about with those poor people who do get COVID-19 and are intubated and all of this. I keep thinking, like, if I were to get it and we're in that state, how would I do my daily practice? I mean, there is that sort of thought of like, I want to maintain that commitment, because a lot of the commitments I have gone back. They go back like, over 20 years. Things that I've been doing daily. All that time. So again, I think it is important that we try to maintain some seriousness around that. But as was pointed out by Geshe Awandarge, it also means kind of keeping the goal of enlightenment in your mind through maintaining the vision of yourself in the form of that deity, all the qualities that entails, and making sure that you live your life as best as you can from that place of that motivation of achieving enlightenment through the tantric path. Tantric path being that quicker path that will get us to enlightenment based on our really deep compassion for others. Then we have the rest of verse 17, which seems to be about a whole different thing. When a hint of procrastination and laziness arises, at that instant, enumerate your flaws and recall the essence of spiritual conduct. So the idea of procrastination and laziness, we talked about this yesterday, so I don't need to reiterate that. But whenever we have this laziness, whether it be the procrastination, the attachment to our worldly activities, the despondency we sometimes feel looking at the complexities of the path and how hard it is to practice, whatever type of laziness arises, we should essentially at that time enumerate our flaws. Kind of, again, this sounds kind of harsh, but the idea is that if we look at how we lack certain things, that actually will be the impetus for us to get off our butts and do what we need to do, to engage in our practice, to do our study, to meditate, whatever the case might be, because we see that those are actually things we want to attain. Once more, if we had the first line, this is where the first line does seem to fit in to some degree. If you are maintaining your commitment, especially within this idea of I need to become enlightened as quickly as possible for the benefit of others through the tantric path and so on, well, then there's no room for laziness in that, right? If it's as quickly as possible, it means you do it with some concerted effort. recognizing that we still do have some things that, will keep us from being wholeheartedly devoted in that way, and dedicated in that way. That's why we often need this power, to maintain our enthusiasm. One of the powers is the idea of relinquishing, recognizing that there are times when we need to say, okay, I've accomplished this task. What like Naga was saying in terms of having this whole, uh, uh, what was it, the paper that you had written, the proposal or whatever, that was all done. Maybe at that time you can take some, time to replenish the energy, to acknowledge, okay, I got all of that done. Now I can rest for a bit so I can go back and do more. There's nothing wrong with that as long as we maintain that attitude that we're just going to keep moving forward. But we do have to rest occasionally. We do have to replenish our strength. But the idea here is when laziness is the opposite of that. Laziness is when we start getting sucked into all of that and we think, I'm just going to chill out on the couch for another 10 hours. Well, that's not the best way to use our lives either. Our lives are so short. That's why I said earlier, remembering impermanence and death is one of the best antidotes to any of these delusions, because our life is not so long when it comes down to it. We think it's long, and some of you who are younger listening to this may think your life is incredibly long, but you don't really know. You may not live to the age I've lived to, or some of the other folks here have lived to, or your grandparents lived to, or whatever. We never know when death is going to come. So we have a lot of ways that we can sort of enumerate our flaws, or the things that we haven't achieved, the things that are kind of beckoning us to pay attention and make sure that we use this life well and don't let procrastination take over. And then it says, recall the essence of spiritual conduct. This is said by the commentaries I've read to refer to our inner guru. Kind of the essence of our spiritual conduct is our own inner wisdom that we have. The role of an outer guru on our spiritual path, that outer teacher, the people we refer to as our lamas, our gurus, is to awaken this inner guru. Through disseminating the Dharma to us, through helping us to adopt this ourselves, we have to learn to rely upon our own inner wisdom at the deepest level. That's the purpose that those gurus serve. There's no other purpose for the Buddhas and the gurus in it than to awaken your own inner guru, to rely upon, as it says, the essence of our spiritual conduct, which comes from our being most in touch with the Buddha's teachings, through our own having investigated them, heard about them, analyzed them, and then we can act from that place. And that is what will beckon you on to get on the cushion, to do the work, to not let yourself procrastinate, and instead make great progress on your path. So let's take our little break now. We're getting there. We don't have so much left now. We're at the top of the 4th page with verse 18, which we'll get into when we return. And remember that we did cover some of the later verses earlier when we talked about the 7 gems, the wealth of the noble beings, and so on. So let's see. I've got 2 minutes after. Let's go till 1/4 after. I think we'll be fine and be able to get through this. And if not, again, we'll do the best that we can. But let's take about a 13-minute break then, and we'll return and continue. All right, I'll see you shortly. Okay, I think we're in the home stretch here now. Let me ring the bell just in case people have wandered away. Okay. Good. I noticed there were a few comments on the chat box. I want to go through those real quickly before we get back to the text. Um, Denise shared that on the verse that we just went through around the procrastination, that we get off our butts or get on them to meditate. It's kind of a good one. Get off your butt or get on your butt if you want to meditate. But anyway, it's kind of a nice one. And then Laura wrote, in regards to processing and recognizing pride, I would love to hear more about divine pride. Is this a pride that we can understand to be beneficial? Is rejoicing considered a form of divine pride? The term divine pride is used in the tantric teachings to refer specifically to the feeling of kind of an identification with the Buddha figure that we are working with. So we talked earlier about the yidam, or the deity that you are initiated into. So say again, you're initiated into green Tara, and then you do a practice where you generate as Tara, you dissolve everything into emptiness, and you think that from emptiness, from this lack of anything existing inherently, you're going to arise in the form of the Buddha Tara. So then you want to maintain this vision of you being the that particular Buddha, being Tara, and being it completely, so that it's not just sort of a passing thought, a fleeting thought of, oh, I'm Tara, but I'm really Don. It's really identification with that Buddha figure. That's what we mean by divine pride. So we use the word pride there in a non-diluted sense to think that we are actually identifying with the resultant state. Remember, Tantra is all about taking the resultant state and thinking, I'm going to be it right now. It's said to be the quick path because of that, because we don't think, oh, I'm going to keep parading along and creating all the causes, and then eventually I'll get to the result way out there. It's, I'm going to think of the result right now, So anyway, that's hopefully, with rejoicing, we don't really use the term divine pride there so much. But again, I would say all those other things, though, that help us to booster our self-esteem, our self-confidence, those are fine things to bring to mind, but not let it go to our heads. Again, the pride is the puffing up, the thinking that we're superior on the basis of that. But we do need to have some again, pride in a sense, but not diluted pride in terms of our accomplishments and what we have done, and rejoicing in those to help us to do more. But recognize that, again, we do always have something more to do. That's one of the best ways we diminish our pride, is recognizing that we do have some faults and we do have an ability, or the necessity, to keep going on the path. So let me see, I think there may have been something. Okay. All right. I don't think there was anything more, just a comment.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Let's go back to sharing the screen and get back into the verses then, because as I said, we don't have so many left, though there are a few that are a little bit longer in terms of the commentary. I wanted to share, before we get back into the next verse, a wonderful little story. There's this wonderful practitioner named Geshe Ben Kongyo, who was one of the Kadampa masters, apparently. And he says, we should follow the example of Geshe Ben Kongyo, who, when he found himself getting lazy, would say to himself, if you do not watch out, I'm going to tell everyone exactly what you're doing and expose you in a disgraceful way. We should follow our inner teacher and correct our own faults. This inner discipline and regret at mistakes is the essence of the practice. Geshe Ben Kongyo, was very good about practicing, kind of training his inner voice to be really good at disciplining himself. The story goes that he was a thief before he found Buddhism. And so there was one time when he was in the kitchen of this family that was hosting him, and there was all this barley grain. The Tibetans eat a lot of barley. And the family had left the kitchen for a bit, and he saw his hand going into the bag of barley to steal some of it. And he grabbed his hand with the other hand and said, "Stop, thief." And of course they come running into the kitchen, and he's like holding his own hand in the bag. I really like the stories of Geshe Ben Kongyo. I wish there were more. I don't know where there are more. If anyone knows where there are more, let me know, because I've read a few in the Lam Rim texts. And anyway, he's an amazing practitioner. But he showed kind of that ability to find things in the moment. I mean, you start going astray and then you can correct. And I think most of us need to hear that, because we're not perfect from the get-go. Verse 18 says, However, this is again, if you are in solitude, because remember a couple of verses ago, we were talking about abiding in solitude and being in that peaceful place. But if you do encounter others, and that can also be when you're just in your daily life, not in solitude and encountering others, speak peacefully and truthfully. Do not grimace or frown, but always maintain a smile. There's times when these verses almost sound like kind of uh, the advice from Miss Manners or something. Miss Manners is going to come up a little bit later because Alex thought one of the things was sort of some advice from Miss Manners that was really quite dharmic. But this is true. We go about our life, as I said earlier, why not be happy? Why not, smile at people, be very peaceful with them, gentle with them, kind with them. This is our best way for us to be with others, not just because, it's not a tool to manipulate them. We did talk about how you have these four means of gathering disciples, and one of them is to speak gently with them, to be kind to them, pleasant with them, and so on. It doesn't mean that we're manipulating people to get them into, like our cult or something. This isn't how we want to approach it. The idea is that this is the best way to be with others. It means that they have nothing to fear from us. We're giving them that generosity of protecting them from danger, from fear. We're actually inviting them into whatever it is that we're about, and they can make their own choices. People in Buddhism is very much about just people making their own choices. They can say, well, sorry, this guy's a bit too smiley. I'm on my way. Nice to say hi to him on the streets of San Francisco, but I really don't want much more to do with him. But this is a good way to be in the world. I don't know that I need to say much more about that because I think that's pretty self-evident in terms of what that verse says. The next one, and nonetheless, I did add one little verse in here from Shantideva. I forgot to make notes of some of these because I added some things the last few days when I went through these slides. Be the master of yourself and have an ever-smiling countenance. Rid yourself of scowling, wrathful frowns, and be a true and honest friend to all. So this is, again, from Shantideva, who was in the 8th century, so few centuries before. Then there's also a little quote that this is a cute little book called Like a Yeti Catching Marmots, a little treasury of Tibetan proverbs. A smile wins 100 hearts, a frown not even one. So it's a little Tibetan proverb that says kind of the same essence that we just looked at. Verse 19, in general, when you see others, be free of miserliness and delight in giving. Relinquish all thoughts of envy. They do say that one of those other means of gathering disciples is to give to others. People do like to receive things. That's why the free Dharma books that we have in our centers, I think, are so important. They had a little poll that they sent out to the centers a few years back asking, should we keep printing these things, or do, think people are going more to finding things online and what have you? And I said, yes, keep printing them. It's good to give something to people that come to our centers. Giving them things is a very powerful way to create some positive connection with them. Again, it doesn't mean that we're manipulating them in any way. It just means that we're trying to be kind, to give them something that will be a benefit to them. And giving them Dharma is the most beneficial thing we can do for them. So we should have a mind of giving with others. We shouldn't be so tight with our things, stingy. Take great delight in whatever way we can give. And we talked about giving yesterday. Relinquish all thoughts of envy. So the first thing is about our possessions and what we have, and giving that to others. And then the second one is not having envy about the possessions of others and having a mind that isn't delighting in that. Here's where rejoicing that was mentioned earlier in Laura's question is a powerful practice. If we rejoice in what other people have, their good qualities, their material possessions, their good fortune, that's a very powerful way to get rid of any of our thoughts of jealousy or envy. Then verse 20. To help soothe others' minds, forsake all disputation, all contention, and be endowed with forbearance. This is also a good part of our practice, is not to be a pain in the side, a thorn in the side of other people. Really be soothing with them, not create arguments with them, not get involved in all sorts of, disputes with them. Instead, be patient and tolerant. Remember, there's that verse that's going to come up in the slides from the 8 verses. But first, from Alex's oral commentary, he says, we try to please others, to make them happy and to not contradict them. That's what contention means, to contradict somebody and to argue with them. Tsongkhapa said it very nicely. If you agree with the other person, that ends the argument. We just agree. I agree with you. I'm not going to argue with you. Then it's finished. But we get so caught up in our views and what we think, and we think we have to argue and put it forward. And I don't know, it's just crazy. But again, this is the verse from the 8 verses that talks about giving the victory to others. When out of envy, others mistreat me with insults, abuse, and the like, I shall accept defeat and offer the victory to others. And this is a very powerful way to go about one's life, to get not so caught up in who's right and who's wrong. We get that kind of indignation when somebody is saying something that we know to be totally wrong. I'm not saying it's not useful sometimes to correct people in their misinformation or misunderstanding, but my gosh, we spend so much energy around it. I was going to share a story that is in Ajahn Brahm's book, who ordered this truckload of dung. I don't know if anyone's read that book. It's a really cute book because, that's how we feel when problems come into our life, right? Who ordered this truckload of dung? I didn't. It's not my responsibility. But karmically, we did order that truckload of dung. Anyway, that's the title of the book. I'll read this. It's not so long. And I've changed the genders because, again, we're living in a much more gender fluid society these days. And so I'm calling the 2 people involved the one and the other. And you can put whatever genders you want to put on that, or lack of gender, or whatever, works for you. This was a favorite story, he says, of his teacher, Ajahn Chah of Northeast Thailand. A couple went out for a walk in the woods together one fine summer evening after dinner. They were having such a wonderful time together until they heard a sound in the distance. Quack, quack. Listen, said the one, that must be a chicken. No, that was a duck, said the other. No, I'm sure that was a chicken, said the one said. Impossible. Chickens go cock-a-doodle-doo, ducks go quack, quack. That's a duck, darling, the other said, with the first signs of irritation. Quack, quack, it went again. See, it's a duck, the other said. No, dear, that's a chicken. I'm positive. Listen, you, that is a duck. D-U-C-K, duck. Got it? The other said angrily. But it's a chicken, the one protested. It's a friggin' duck, you, and it went quack, quack again before they said something they oughtn't. The one was almost in tears. But it's a chicken. The other saw the tears welling up in their partner's eyes and said, at last, remembering their love for each other, with a softened voice, sorry, darling, I think you must be right. That is a chicken. Thank you, darling, the one said, squeezing the other's hand. Quack, quack came the sound through the woods as they continued their walk together in love. So I like that story. Maybe I don't tell it the best. I shouldn't be like a reader of children's books, I don't think. But how many of you have had a chicken and a duck story in your life recently? Or like with your partner or a family member or something, you argue about something that really doesn't amount to a hill of beans. It's not going to be the end of the world if you're wrong. So accept the defeat and give the victory to others. Yeah, it's a chicken, no problem. It's quacking like crazy, but it's a chicken. You don't have to get all, on your soapbox about it, So anyway, I like that story and kind of illustrates for me very much the sentiment of this particular verse. Verse 21, be free of flattery and fickleness in friendship. Be steadfast and reliable at all times. Do not disparage others, but always abide with respectful demeanor. Here too, once more, this might sound like just some good common sense advice, but how many of us have had some fickleness in our friendship where we've been with people for a while and then something goes astray and we go on to the next person, or that person ceases to be the person that we're looking for in terms of things we do with them, or enjoying their conversation and company, and so then we go on to someone else. Don't flatter people, just to get friends. Be genuine in your friendships with others. I think we do. I mentioned on Friday night this whole technique of developing equanimity, that we do have to kind of get rid of our attitudes towards these 3 groups. But our friends are a very important part of our spiritual path. Why? Because they are the ones that have already awakened so many of these qualities in ourselves. So we should be true to those friends. We should be dedicated to those friends. There's nothing wrong with taking care of your friends. Just don't get attached to your friends. Attachment is the mind that is thinking of it in terms of what you get from them. You become attached to them and want them to do what they're doing to satisfy you. And you keep doing things for them because that's the quid pro quo, as they say. So we have to be aware that that's something that we get caught up in with our friends very often. We should have unconditional love for our friends, and they're the easiest to have it with. So treat your friends well. Don't, kind of disregard them when they cease to be entertaining and fun and whatever. you know Again, this is within the context of, we talked earlier about negative friends, those people who are close to us who are maybe going to take us astray or spiritually. That's a different dimension to this. But those people who are in our lives who love us and care about us and take great care to do things for us and so on, take good care of them. Be attentive to them. Again, I think it's pretty obvious stuff, but nonetheless, Atisha seems to want to point it out. So be steadfast and reliable at all times. I mean, this is how we actually please others, right? If I'm never reliable, and I don't have a continuity in terms of how I deal with things, somebody writes an email to me and I never reply to them, and other people I'm really quite attentive to, we should really be reliable for all. There's sometimes when I miss emails and I feel so bad about it because I really do want to be reliable, but it's hard sometimes to be reliable all the time. Not disparaging others, not putting them down. These are pretty obvious things. They don't really endear others to us if we're doing that. And abide with a respectful demeanor. So here's where I liked what Alex shared here. He says, he uses kind of a tangent to this. He says, but what do we do when people come to us just to exploit us? People who just want to get something from us, and who, when they no longer find us useful, go away. So what happens when you see that sort of fickleness in other people who are out to get something from you? Here we're talking about avoiding that, not being fickle in our own friendships. He says, first of all, if we're practicing as bodhisattvas, we are happy if they come to us. We are happy if we can help them. If they go away, that's their loss. That's their loss. And it's so sad that they are no longer open to our help, So again, we don't have to get too invested in it. Acknowledge that some people come, they get what they want, and then they are on their way. Don't take it personally. Now, in regard to exploitation, we give what's appropriate. We don't overgive, which could be harmful to them and to us. We don't let them be a complete drain on us. We set limits. I like that Alex says this kind of advice, and that's why I'm sharing it, because I think he says it so well. Sometimes we feel like as bodhisattva wannabes that we have to just be giving anybody whatever they want. And, that isn't appropriate. Remember the story of Shariputra that we talked about, where he's giving, his hand, but with the wrong hand, and then he kind of loses his faith in others because he's been taken advantage of to some degree. I think we have to be setting limits and being very careful about not overextending ourselves. Then he says, as Ringu Tulku said very nicely, so many people might ask us for things, but there are only so many requests that we can fulfill. We can't multiply ourselves into a million forms at the same time yet. We're not yet Buddhas. Nonetheless, we at least try to give them something, a little something, so that we're not totally rejecting them. I had an instance recently where somebody contacted me hadn't been to the center in many, many years, and I know him, but I hadn't seen him, and I didn't develop, that much of a working relationship with him either, but was asking me for things that I felt were beyond what I could supply at the time, and so I made it very clear that I would offer, so much. I would be able to meet with him at a particular time and whatever, and do what I could, but I really couldn't, do more beyond that. And it was really quite helpful. In the end, we didn't meet at all because I guess what I was offering him perhaps wasn't fitting into his schedule or really working for him. And, I'll be open to an additional way, but I do feel like we do have to sometimes say, okay, that's more than what I can handle right now. That's more than what I can commit to. Because even during the little break here, I went to my email, which I probably shouldn't have been doing, but I saw an email asking for some help with a particular project. And I'm like going, I'm not so sure I have time for that right now. It's okay to say that you really can't fit it in, or you can't make the time for it. I'm getting better at saying that. I can't make the time for that right now, rather than saying I don't have time for that. We all have time for whatever it is we choose to do with our time. But we do make decisions about what I make time for and what I can't make time for right now, because I just don't feel that I can fit it in with the other things that I have, because I'm making a better commitment, deeper commitment to those things. I think that's how we have to look at our lives. Otherwise, I'm afraid we're going to, again, kind of get overcommitted, get burnt out, do things beyond what we can actually handle. And then this is where he brings in Miss Manners. He says, when it comes to telling someone we can't do something, I am reminded of a lovely line from Miss Manners. Miss Manners is an American newspaper's etiquette queen of whom one asks questions about etiquette. Miss Manners, Miss Good Manners, says that in such situations, we just say, I'm so sorry. We don't give excuses. I get bad about giving excuses. Sometimes I go, well, I've got this going on and that going on, and I really don't feel I'm qualified to do this or whatever. But she says, we don't give reasons why we can't help. We just say, oh, I'm so sorry. I won't be able to do that. We don't explain. If we were to explain, they'd give us an argument about it. And then we'd have to get defensive. We just say, I'm so sorry. Great guru, Miss Manners. So, I think there's something to be said for that. Why do we have to get into a whole litany of things of why we can't do something? Just say, oh, I'm so sorry. I can't do that right now. And that leave it at that. And then the person, if they're really wanting to know why, well, then they'll ask, and then we maybe get into it or don't. Maybe we say, oh, it's not so important why I can't. I just can't right now. But be clear in your own mind why you're saying that. Don't be saying that because you think that person's a pain in the butt and you don't really want to deal with them when you know that you could actually be helpful to them. Be clear about what your reasons are. That if you recognize that it's beyond what you can commit to, what you have the abilities for and talent for and so on, well, then there's nothing wrong with simply saying no. No is a very powerful word. We don't use it maybe as often as we should. Maybe sometimes we overuse it. Whoops, hit it twice there. Verse 22, the first part, first two lines, when giving advice, maintain compassion and altruism. I don't know that I need to say much about that one. Obviously, when you're giving advice, don't be thinking about any of your own motives or delusions. When we are giving advice, it should be because we are genuinely concerned about the suffering of that person in front of us. It's not about us at all. And it's not about getting accolades from them of saying, thank you so much. This was the best advice I've ever gotten from anybody or whatever. You just do it because you care, because you don't want that person to suffer. Okay. And then verse 22, the rest of it, there are 6 lines in verse 22. Never defame the teachings. Whatever practices you admire, with aspiration and the 10 spiritual deeds, strive diligently, with no distinction between day and night. So I'm going to go through this rather quickly. These 10 spiritual deeds that are mentioned are a variety of, there's 2 different ways of approaching it, and within each there are a variety of things. But the idea is, as it says here, whatever practices you admire, whatever it is that you feel inclined to do, strive diligently in those. Aspire to do those day and night. And of course, never defame the teachings, never denigrate the teachings. This is not a very useful thing for us to do because it ends up creating a disconnect between ourselves and the Dharma. But these 10 spiritual deeds are set out in 2 ways, as I mentioned. In Geshe Awan Darge's commentary, he says, as an awakening warrior, which was the term they used for bodhisattva, we should intensively follow the practices of the 10 transcendent perfections, the perfections of a bodhisattva. The first 6 are the commonly known ones: generosity, ethical discipline, patience, enthusiastic effort, meditative stability, and intelligent awareness or wisdom. We've touched on all of those through this weekend, right? We talked about giving and maintaining good ethical behavior, patience, being enthusiastic, concentration through meditation, wisdom of emptiness. The 4 additional ones are strength, prayers of aspiration for the path, skillful means, and primordial awareness. Of course, these aren't developed until, fully until much later on our path, but we can try to generate that sort of power that wants to, keep moving forward, prayers that make aspirations for our own path and for others. The skillful means, what the Sanskrit word is upaya. Upaya means essentially our ability to act correspondingly with what people need, to be completely in line with what it is that will be of use to them, beneficial for them. You won't have that again fully until you're a Buddha, but we can begin working on that now. And then primordial awareness is sort of the deepest level of awareness that we want to generate. It's the 10th perfection of a bodhisattva. It's close to Buddhahood. So I don't know that I can say much more about that. The aforementioned list is for those who are practitioners, of the great vehicle, the Mahayana. For those who do not engage actively in this path, there is another set of 10 general practices explained by Maitreya, the coming Buddha. These are known as the 10 practices of one day. And they involve copying and writing out the scriptures. By the way, I do have a little bit of commentary on this from Alex Berzin that I'm going to send to Donna along with the PDF file of the slides. So if you want to get that to have more commentary, because I'm just feeling like with the amount of time left, it might be best for me not to comment on each of these. But copying and writing out scriptures, making offerings to the three supreme jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, giving generously to the poor and sick, listening to discourses on Dharma, reading scriptures to oneself and others, taking to heart the essence of the teachings through meditation, explaining the meaning of the Dharma, reciting the Heart Sutra or any of the Buddha sutras, contemplating the meaning of the texts, meditating single-pointedly on the meaning of the teachings. So can we do all 10 of these in a day? These are said to be the daily 10 practices, right? The 10 practices of one day. Very unlikely that we're going to do all of these in a day, even on our wheel turning days, those special Buddha days that we have in the calendar. It's hard to do all of these in one day, but you can maybe do some of them. So again, the idea is that we'd find ways to stay engaged in the Dharma, to not let the Dharma degenerate. Remember, the first line of that verse was don't disparage the Dharma. Instead, we want to bring the Dharma into our lives through our practices of the 10 perfections, as well as these various activities. And Alex, of course, in his commentary points out that there are many things that could also be included in this: transcribing teachings, writing up the teachings you've received. I know some people do that. They take notes of teachings or record them, and then they go back and they write them up into a more formal document for them. That's a nice way to review the teachings that you've received. Or again, I'll be sending these slides. Go back through the slides and try to remind yourself of what we all discussed. Alex continues, Geshe Awan Darge continues. He says, thus we should perform the 10 transcendent perfections or the 10 daily practices, thereby pointing all our actions in a skillful direction. So this is, again, a really useful kind of way of going about our day. Atisha's giving us some instruction about how we use our days virtuously, making sure that we have some ability to practice each of those in a day if possible. Now, those of you who are already quite engaged in Buddhism know that you probably have more than enough things to do in a day, and some of them include some of those things on that list. I'm not saying you have to add all these things to your practice. Just entertain them occasionally. Maybe, one day you might spend as a sort of retreat day solely focused on reading a particular text. And you can even read it out loud to your pets in the room or whatever, or other people who might be there. Or you can simply do, another day where you might do just recitations of sutras. It's very powerful to recite sutras that the Buddha wrote and kind of create that sort of energy that is involved in the Buddha's words. So again, those are all the things that are set out. Let me look at my notes to see if there was anything more on this. As I said, I will have this it's just a little one-sided document that kind of gives a little bit of commentary that Alex gives on these various 10 that may be useful for you to just see what those look like. Let me do the final verse that is before they do the dedication verses, and you'll notice that we're going to go out of order again. Remember how I said that in the biography of Atisha Dipankara, that also includes a translation of some of his texts by James Apple, that in his version, he moved a couple things around. He moved the first part of 25, or all of 25, and the first part of 26, he moved that to just after verse 7, or part of 7. And then here he's moving the last two lines of verse 26 to this place, which is essentially between 22 and 23. So this is also one of the most well-known verses from this text. Among others, guard your speech. When alone, guard your mind. I find this to be, again, just a really nice one to live my day with, to kind of continually think about as I'm with others, whatever that might be, whether I'm, in a Zoom meeting, or whether I'm in the grocery store, or whether I'm, going out for my walk during the day, try to get some exercise in the midst of this pandemic, try to guard my speech, to make sure that I don't say things that are not beneficial, that I try to follow all the qualities that Atisha set out earlier in regard to making our speech very gentle and kind and welcoming and what have you. But when we're alone, the big task is to guard our minds. Now, with others, you're also guarding your mind to some degree. I'm not denying that. But the main way that we are connecting with others, as I mentioned earlier, when we are in the company of others, is through our speech. And our speech is such an important way of connecting or disconnecting from others. So use your speech very well, guard your speech, make sure that it's of benefit to others. And when you're alone, guard your mind, because that's when we get into trouble, right? We start doing things that, oh, my mind is really telling me, my conscientiousness is saying, I really should be doing a bit more practice today. I need to do some meditation, or I need to do this or that. And the other part of your mind, that laziness part or the attachment to worldly activities, is saying, no, it's really a good idea to veg out and watch more Netflix and whatever. So we have to watch our minds. Guarding your mind is one of the main tasks of Buddhism. That's why I say Buddhism is a 24/7 venture, because we need to watch our minds all the time. It's not just, again, those 3 times during the day and 3 times during the night that we saw earlier that you check your thoughts. It's throughout our day that we want to be attentive to what's going on in our minds and make sure that we don't get caught up in patterns that are going to be taking us many steps back. It's like we go forward a few steps whenever we do our practice and are dedicated to things, and then we take a few steps back, and then we go a few steps forward and a few steps back. We got to make sure we're taking more steps forward, or we're just going to keep degenerating. If we're meant to be practicing the Dharma and our minds are getting worse, well, then we're not practicing the Dharma so well. Your mind should be improving. You should have less that you have to guard the mind from, because the mind is getting better about not going to those habitual places, not continuing to further the delusions. So I love ending kind of the main part of the text with this. In the regular translation, the way it's set out by Thupten Jinpa, the way it's come down in the Tibetan through some versions, I assume, it is at the very end. But it almost seems like an afterthought at the end, because we go into the next few verses that are mostly about dedication. And so it doesn't seem maybe as quite relevant there. But here is like the last sort of gem of advice before talking about the need to dedicate as also good advice. I think is really nice, because if you get nothing else from this whole weekend other than that instruction, when you're with others, guard your speech. When you're alone, guard your mind. That's great. That sums up all of our Buddhist practice in many, many ways. So before we do the dedication verses, let me look at not really solely dedication verses, but they talk about dedication. And so in that way, I'm going to kind of be presenting them towards the end of this. Let me look at what's in the chat box. I find it difficult at times, especially with my teenage children, not to be enabling, but to be there for them. I think it is a balance, especially with people who we're trying to encourage to take responsibility, to do what they need to do, to mature, to develop in this world, to be responsible citizens in this world. It's important to have some hands off, but then we also have to be hands on at the times when they need that guidance, be like their training wheels, but eventually the training wheels are just there so that they can ride the bike without them, so I think that is a challenge. I appreciate you bringing that up, Linda. And I think we all have to do the best with whatever, because some of us might not have children or teenagers in our lives, but we have other people in our lives who are still in need of not being enabled, not being taken care of to a degree where they don't take care of themselves. And then Naga adds, I started letting my friends know I am off the phone on weekends, usually under some learning for truth. Took a lot of practice to say no. Good. I think that's really a good practice. You can say to people, no, this is the time I'm dedicating for my practice, and I don't want to be interrupted. If you send me an email or you call or whatever, I won't be answering it. But, know that I don't, it's not that I don't care about you. It's just that I have to have limits. Okay, and again, Donna just reminded people that her email address is in the chat box. If you would like the slides from the presentation or the handout I'm going to send, and I'll see if I've got any other things that I want to throw in there, but I think those 2 documents in particular will be what I'm thinking I'd send out now. Let me open it up to see if there are any other questions. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to bring up, or even comments? Again, I'm happy to hear comments from people. If you say, oh, when you said this, it made me think of that, or whatever. I find those things quite useful. So anyone? No?
I have something.
All right, Ginger. Good.
Okay, just to jump in?
Yes, please.
Okay. In the beginning, there were so many things that connected to this, and I'm quite fascinated by this.
Uh-huh.
Okay, at first you talked about how at, being attachment to the Dharma. If we have attachment to the Dharma, um, let's see, how do we keep the right mindset to practice? And then it connected to clinging to something new instead of being like a bee and going to a bunch of different things. And then, and then what do we do with our time? It has to interest us, so we have to want to do it a lot, I guess. And then it may feed our delusions. So how do we know if it's feeding our delusions and our attachment to really love the Dharma and just want to be stuck in that, and we're not being like the little bee and going around it?
Yeah, I found it interesting too, Ginger. I realized as I was doing my preparation again, there are times when it seems like the advice almost you're not really sure which way it's supposed to go. Because when you read that phrase, especially the one where about the bee, that almost sounds like, the way you don't want to be is like,
Right.
why do I just keep going around to other things? I think everything that's used as an analogy, you almost have to have another explanation to make sure you're seeing the analogy in the right way. And it gets to be quite complicated. Ideally, again, we want to have minds that are not so attached to needing things to be the way that we want them to be. And so being very flexible is the idea behind the bee analogy, that, you go to whatever flower, you don't hang out at the wildflowers that you really like, oh, these delicious, purple wildflowers are the best. I'm just going to hang out here. You go to wherever you find nectar. You go to wherever it's sort of useful for you to be, and you don't get too attached to anything. And in terms of attachment to the Dharma, I don't know if I talked about it that extensively, but I think it is an important thing to be wary of, to be cautious about, because as we approach something that is enticing us and making us feel good, we have those patterns of attachment. Now, somebody told me that I think one teacher mentioned once that you can't get attached to a virtuous object, but I would beg to differ. I think a lot of us still have patterns where we have an overlay of qualities that maybe again is distorted to some degree. Why they say you can't be attached to Dharma is because if you were talking about a Buddha or an object that is imbued with perfect qualities, well, you can't exaggerate the qualities because they're perfected. But I think we still lay a lot of our own worldly stuff on things like that. We lay that on the Dharma to some degree. Lama Yeshe actually talked about abandoning our attachment to Dharma a lot. And maybe I'll even throw that in there. There's one little teaching I found that was about Lama Yeshe talking about not getting attached to our path. It's like we're using, once more, turning a god into a demon. We're taking something that is meant to be positive, like the Dharma, and making it into something that only creates more confusion for us. So what does attachment to the Dharma look like? I think that may be an interesting exercise for each of us to look at in terms of our own relationship to the Dharma. But I would say, once more, is it mostly where we look at things that are solely satisfying ourselves but aren't helping us to grow and develop, where we like to hear certain things but we don't like to hear others because those are more challenging for us? That may be an indication that we've got a lot of attachment to certain Dharma. Everyone loves to hear all of the teachings on certain topics, and then when it comes to like the hell realms and that, nobody wants to go there, right? So we find like our own picking and choosing and being a bit, you know yeah, I don't know what the right word is, but not accepting the Dharma in its totality and sort of being okay with the things that we don't necessarily find flattering to our ego or complimenting our ego. And then also we can see it in relation to how we look at our own spiritual path in relation to others' spiritual paths. If we get a bit too much of the head filled with our own, oh, I found the Buddha Dharma and look at me, don't I smell great or whatever? Well, that's not a good way to go about living our lives, and that's not going to endear us to others. I mentioned, I don't know if it was yesterday or Friday, but I sit on an interfaith group here in Santa Fe, and I find it so useful for my practice to be in a room of people who are as dedicated to their path as I want to think I am. Maybe I'm not, but you can be with others and totally respect that the path that they follow, although it has very contradictory things to what I follow in Buddhism, is it means as much to them and as important to them as what my path is to me. And I can be there in that space of respect and not feel like I have to, have this great attachment to my Dharma being the only way and blah, 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 all that sort of exclusivity that becomes a problem in spiritual circles. So I think that, we can test it in a number of ways, but this is an investigation that each of us has to do with regard to our relationship to the Dharma. People who are new to the Dharma, as I mentioned earlier, they're very good to be around because they have that great enthusiasm, but they can often bring a lot of that same kind of attachment to it. And then when they see something that doesn't meet with that attachment, they get to the teachings on the hell realm. They, happen to go to a teaching with Rinpoche where he talks about the hell realm the whole night. Then they go, well, the Buddha Dharma is not for me. Sorry, Buddhism is not my thing. Because they have this attachment to wanting the teachings that please them, that help their ego to feel good about themselves. I find as a teacher, you can tell by listening to me, and even what I mentioned, Venerable Rabina's comment about me being all kind of gentle and feminine and soft versus her being really charging masculine kind of energy. But, I have a hard time being really kind of brutally honest with people sometimes. And I do have people I talk to that are engaged in patterns that I would really love for them to break out of. But it's hard for me to kind of be forceful in doing that. Well, a lot of that's my own attachment to a reputation or worldly things or whatever. I don't want people to think poorly of me. We have to be careful in all that stuff. We're such people pleasers, So again, I'm getting mixing in a few different issues here, but I think attachment is one of those things that once more becomes very pernicious. It kind of sneaks in there and we don't even recognize where it's operating sometimes. So this is why, once more, that wonderful title of Lama Yeshe's book, Becoming Your Own Therapist. We need to be our own therapists. We need to be continually examining these ideas, just as you brought up, Ginger, and saying, well, what's the real meaning of this? What is it how do I really apply this in my life? How do I make sure that I'm using the teachings in a correct way so that I actually diminish my delusions and increase my positive qualities rather than through subterfuge somehow increase all my delusions and never really gain any good qualities? So it's a tricky thing. I don't have an absolute answer, but maybe that gives you some things to work with.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that question. That was good, Ginger. Anyone else, anything before we go to the final verses of the text?
Hey, John.
Yes.
I would just like to
Oh,
say that,
Laura. Yeah.
hi.
Hi.
I enjoyed when you talked about perspective. And it always amazes me how things that I know, if they're told differently in a different way, just resonate more so.
Oh, good.
And so the perspective, and also don't believe everything you think. I want that bumper sticker. But anyway.
Yeah, it's a good one to be mindful of. Great.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome, Laura. Thank you for those comments. Again, I think it is important that we, take something from the weekend, the things or the week that I spent here in terms of what you really would like to use most. I've said so many words. I didn't say as many words as Venerable Rabino would say in 3 days or 5 days that evenings I taught, whatever. But just, take a few things from what I go through and, or any teacher goes through. If you attend a teaching, don't think that it's your job then to apply everything that was said over the course of those days into your life. It's just impossible to do that right from the get-go. So choose the one or two things. And again, maybe it is some personal bias that you might have that says, oh, I'm going to go to those teachings because I really like that. But you also might look at it and go, well, what is it that I really need to work on? Where do I feel that I'm failing most or not really living up to the ideals that I would like to? And what teachings can I gain from whatever teacher, whatever book I read or anything that will help me to address that and then work on that with those teachings? It's better to pick one or two little things out of a teaching than to think, oh, I'm going to take all this, because you're going to get discouraged if you try to take it all on. My gosh, I've been practicing for quite a few years, and there's no way I perfected even a few of these things that we talked about this weekend. So you just keep working with what you can and doing the best that you can, and that's going to be a little bit of Geshe Awan Darge's advice. But thank you for sharing that, Laura, and also, yeah, thank you so much for your question, Ginger. Let's put the screen share back on. Oh, Denise has got something she shared for us. Let me go to that. I don't want to kind of short shrift anybody. Let's see, a golden nugget for me, for Denise, already on a new post-it on the wall, was the Burrs and Points about how to spend our time. Thanks. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate Alex sharing, especially since it came from the Dalai Lama. Those first 3 points were like advice from the Dalai Lama. I don't know if it was in a personal context or if it was something the Dalai Lama said at a teaching, but wow, help me decide how to spend my time. What amazing advice. And then that additional bit from Ringo Tuko, I think, is so appropriate. Until we're a lot less self-centered and self-focused, we are going to have to be doing what appeals to us, what makes us feel good, because that will put energy into that. But don't let that be your guide for the whole spiritual path. Or again, I think we're going to be disappointed, not really get everything that we desire from our spiritual practice. So, let me share this. This was again on that whole idea of watching our speech with others, watching our minds when alone. When with others, we should be mindful not to harm them by careless remarks. One of the Kadam masters said, "We make personal judgments and accusations as if they were all true. I wish there were locks on my mouth and on everyone else's as well." This Kadam master should try Facebook, I think, or any of those Twitter, you know. Yeah, we need a lot of locked mouths, I think, would be good for us. And then this idea of when alone, we should examine our thoughts. Without the attainment of single-pointed concentration, our mind is like a restless child. But even before we attain single-pointedness, we should always try to bring our mind back to a state of stable concentration. Let me skip over these. You can read them on your own later. I want to go ahead and go through these dedication verses. So it says, this is still advice being given to us. Whatever virtues you gather through the 3 times, dedicate them toward the unexcelled great awakening. Of course, this is so important that we engage in that continual dedication of our merits. Disperse your merits to all sentient beings, gladly give them away to others, and utter the peerless aspiration prayers of the 7 limbs at all times. Of course, we know the 7 limbs because we did that prayer at the beginning of each of these teachings. They're on the screen. Once more, I'm not doing commentary on all those, but these are very powerful practices to accumulate merit and to purify negativities. And they end with dedicating. Then in verse 24, if you proceed thus, you'll swiftly perfect merit and wisdom and eliminate the 2 defilements. Again, the afflictive obscurations, which are keeping us from being liberated, all the ignorance and delusions built on that, and the subtle obscurations, those 2 omniscience, which are again those subtle imprints that cause things to appear to exist inherently, that keep us buying into that. These will be the last things we remove on our path. But we can do it through swiftly perfecting our merit and wisdom. Since your human existence will be meaningful, you'll attain the unexcelled enlightenment. And that's a really nice place to end the text. This concludes the Bodhisattva's Jewel Garland, composed by the Indian abbot Dipankara Srijana. Whoops, final advice. A few more slides. Sorry, I'm going a little bit over here. This is from Geshe Ngawang Dargye. The teachings outlined in this text are not solely for Dharma practitioners, but can help anyone who simply wishes to lead a good life. Whether or not we accept such doctrines as past and future lives, if we act as if they did exist, there will be only benefit for ourselves and others. We should be friendly towards others, yet at the same time as stubborn as an ox when it comes to maintaining the purity of our practices. There is a Tibetan proverb, wrap the rope from your nose around your head. Animals who are led by a rope through their nose, through the ring in their nose, are forced to follow where others lead them, right? However, if this rope is wrapped around their own head, where they become in charge of their own behavior, they remain docile and friendly, free to roam where they wish. In a similar manner, if we wrap the rope of ethical discipline around our own head, it is unnecessary to follow some outer imposition of morality. If our discipline comes from within us, our inner guru, we actually need no external authorities as guides because we've learned what we needed from them and we have developed it within ourselves. Dharma practice should not be done as mere ritual, out of obligation or because it is popular. We should not follow Buddhism because it has a growing reputation or has become a trend, but because we realize its benefits. No matter what practices we do, if they help our mind, they are worthwhile. This, in turn, helps all others. So I found that advice to be so sweet that I wanted to share it at the end here. And again, you can get copies of that in the slides. You can also, of course, find it in the book, Advice from a Spiritual Friend, that Geshe Ngawang Dargye and Geshe Repton wrote. So I think I'm done. I think we've all made it to the end, which is quite amazing. I'm going to turn it over to Donna then. So thank you, Donna.
Thank you, Don. And in a moment, we are going to offer a mandala and thanks for the wonderful teachings. But first, I want to just recognize our visiting teacher team, Linda Saw, Laura Carballo, and Susie Bohm, who do a lot of work behind the scenes. And they're help make this happen. Okay, and now I'm going to spotlight Linda. So you can offer the mandala and I'll chant the mandala offering. Saji puki jukshin metog tramri roblingji ni degen padi. Sangye Jingdu Mikte Uwa Idro Kunam Dag Jingla Chuparshog Jetsun Lame. Ooh, this is the wrong one. This is the wrong one. Well, I'll chant this and we'll understand it to be a request for the Lama to remain long. Jetsun Lame. Sorry, I don't have it. Dam pa ke nam ki chu kukala kien se chu zin trig jitar tsampe dul je zin ma La zab ge chuki char pa wab tu so Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Nirya Tayami.
Wonderful. Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Donna, for leading the prayers. Shall we do a few dedication prayers before we conclude then? And also thank you to the program team, all of you. Really appreciate everyone's kind support in making this possible. You know, as I've said previously this week, this isn't the ideal way to be with others in the Dharma, but it's the next best thing. So I appreciate it very much. So yeah, if we could share the dedication prayers, let's go ahead and do those, and then I'll thank everyone else at the end.
Thank you, Don. And I will say one thing that's nice about doing it this way is it feels in some ways more intimate because you know you're right there with us, and so look at the screen and I feel like you're speaking just to me. So that's really quite wonderful.
No, I appreciate that. I do like that as well. I mean, I don't feel like the distance. That's why this whole idea of social distancing. I mean, we're not really distancing. We're just making our other ways to be close, other ways to be social. So. Good.
I am having technical difficulties.
Did I take off my screen share properly? Is it?
Yes, you did. I'm just
okay.
Having a day of there we go.
Okay.
Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Just as the brave Manjushri and Sumatrabhadra too realize things as they are, I too dedicate all these merits in the best way that I may follow their perfect example. I dedicate all these roots of virtue with the dedication praised as the best by the victorious ones thus gone of the 3 times, so I might perform good works. In our short, long life prayers, beginning with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. In a land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Tenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. The one who mastered his speech at a very young age, the one with great patience received the name Avatari, the one with great precision who spread the teachings of Lama Tsongkhapa on bliss and void, Lama, ornament of the yellow hat tradition, please remain until samsara ends. And now for the long life of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, spiritual director of Kadampa Center and FPMT, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjanath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplished magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Om Tare Tu Re So Ha. 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 Om Tare Tu Re So Ha.
So I'd like to also just conclude with making strong dedications for the success of Kadampa Center and all the FPMT centers, and for the community there to have all wonderful conditions, and for everything, of course, in the world to be cleared up so we have the conditions once more to meet in person and to be able to share the Dharma in that way. This has been, as we just talked about, very good, but nonetheless, it would be nice for all of that to change in a way so that we can go back to that. And we might also individually make dedications for those people that we're holding in our hearts right now. No doubt every one of us has someone in our lives who is suffering from obstacles or illness, who's dying, or perhaps who has died. And we make strong dedications of the merits that we've created this weekend for their welfare, so that they can be free from all obstacles and illness and so on, all suffering, and that they can find all the conducive conditions that will help them to attain perfect peace and happiness. And may all beings find true peace and happiness through our efforts here through this past week. And again, thank you all so much. This has been so wonderful to share the Dharma with all of you. I'm going to be heading into retreat in about 5 days, so I'm looking forward to that. As I've got one more teaching tomorrow night for the New York group and the Miami group on Shantideva, and then I'll be on my way for 2 weeks of retreat. It'll be nice. I would have been with all of you in Raleigh. I mean, not Raleigh, in Black Mountain at the retreat had, not all this stuff happened, but hopefully we'll have a chance to be together in person next year at the retreat, and perhaps even I'll make my way there to Raleigh sometime. We'll see how things unfold. So again, please stay safe, stay healthy. Do take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and keep your Dharma practice up through all these times. It's so important that we have the Dharma to help us through this. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been a
Thank you.
wonderful week. Wonderful week.
Good.
Thank you
I
so
enjoyed it.
much. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
it's good to see you, Robbie, too. I didn't get a chance to say much to most of you, and Patrick and Susan and
Thank you
Jill,
so
and my
much.
gosh, everyone, Denise. So wonderful to be with all of you. So, okay, you take care now until the next time. Okay, bye-bye.